Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The bayou doesn't forget. That's what my grandfather used to say, spitting tobacco juice into the dark water while we checked crawfish traps in the pre-dawn mist. I never understood what he meant until the morning I found those paddle marks appearing ahead of my boat, rippling across the glass-smooth surface like someone was rowing just out of sight, always parallel to my hull, always keeping pace. I've been guiding fishing tours through these Louisiana wetlands near Houma for 15 years. Know every channel, every cypress grove, every spot where the gators sun themselves on fallen logs. But that morning in late September, with the humidity already pressing down like a wet wool blanket, everything felt different. Wrong. The first sign was the silence. Usually the swamp wakes up noisy, herons calling, insects buzzing, the splash of feeding fish. But that morning, nothing. Just the soft lap of water against my aluminum boat and the whisper of Spanish moss dragging across the surface. Even my regular clients would have noticed something was off. But I was alone, scouting new spots before the busy season. I'd launched from the public dock at first light, navigating by memory through the familiar maze of channels. The paddle marks started appearing about an hour in, when I was deep in the backcountry where cell phones don't work and the canopy blocks out most of the sky. At first, I thought it was just the current playing tricks, or maybe another early morning fisherman ahead of me. But the marks were too regular, too deliberate. Twin lines of disturbed water, perfectly spaced, moving in rhythm with my own strokes. I stopped paddling. The marks continued for 3 more strokes before they too ceased, as if whatever was making them had noticed my pause a few seconds late. My hands tightened on the paddle shaft, knuckles white. The rational part of my brain cycled through explanations, optical illusion, unusual current patterns, maybe even a pair of swimming nutria. But my gut knew better. My gut remembered my grandfather's words. That's when I noticed the whistle. My hand went automatically to my life vest, checking the emergency gear. There, clipped where I always keep my compass, was a brass whistle I had never seen before. It was wet, though I hadn't been in the water. Tarnished and old, like something that had been underwater for years. When I turned it over, my blood went cold. Engraved on the side were initials I hadn't used in 20 years. TJB. Before the divorce, before I legally changed my name to distance myself from everything that reminded me of her, I was Thomas James Bro. Now I'm just Tom Bradley, fishing guide, nobody special. But someone, or something, in this swamp knew who I used to be. The whistle was still dripping, each drop hitting the aluminum hull with a tinny plink that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. I should have thrown it overboard. Should have turned the boat around and headed straight back to the dock. Instead, I clipped it back to my vest with trembling fingers and kept paddling deeper into the maze. The channels narrowed as I pushed further in, following a route I'd mapped years ago but rarely used. Curtains of moss hung so low I had to duck, and the water turned the color of strong coffee, tannin-rich and impenetrable. The paddle marks stayed with me, sometimes ahead, sometimes alongside, but always there. Once, I swung my paddle hard to the left, trying to hit whatever was making them. It passed through empty water. Around noon, though the thick canopy made it hard to judge the time, I heard the radio. It was coming from somewhere ahead, the static broken sound carrying across the water with unnatural clarity. At first, just white noise and occasional pops. Then, as I drifted closer, words began to emerge from the static. The same 2 words, over and over, in a voice that made my spine go rigid. Last cast, last cast, last cast. It was my voice, not similar to mine, not close to mine. It was mine. Down to the slight rasp I get when I've been quiet too long. The exact tone and cadence I use when telling clients they've got time for one more throw before we head in. I followed the sound through a tunnel of cypress trees, their knees jutting from the water like broken teeth. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and a smell like copper and marsh grass filled my nostrils. The paddle marks had stopped, but I barely noticed. All my attention was fixed on that impossible voice, growing clearer with each stroke. The tunnel opened into a small clearing I'd never seen before. There, tied to a pier that had no business existing, not on any map, not in any of my 15 years of exploration, was an old boat radio, the kind nobody's used since the 80s. It sat on the warped wood, antenna extended, crackling with static and my stolen voice. But that wasn't what made me drop my paddle. On the pier, arranged with obsessive precision, was my tackle box. Not one like mine exactly. The scratches on the lid from when I dropped it on oyster shells, the duct tape patch on the corner, the faded LSU sticker I'd put on it in college. But when I opened it with numb fingers, the contents were wrong. All wrong. The lures were arranged in patterns I'd never use, sorted by some logic that felt alien yet purposeful. The hooks were wrong too. Sizes and styles I'd never fish with, arranged in spirals that hurt to look at directly. And at the bottom, wrapped in fishing line that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, was a photo I knew I'd burned 10 years ago. Me and her on our wedding day, except in this version, our faces were turned away from each other, looking at something outside the frame with expressions of absolute terror. The radio static increased, and through it, I heard something that wasn't quite my voice anymore. It was my voice layered over itself, past and present, and maybe future all speaking at once. Last cast, Tommy. Last cast before you come home. I grabbed the tackle box and threw it as far as I could into the black water. It hit with a splash that seemed to echo forever, ripples spreading in perfect circles that moved too slowly, like the water had turned to syrup. The radio went silent. That's when I noticed the shadows. They were all wrong. The sun, filtered through the canopy, was coming from the west, but the shadows of the cypress trees were stretching east, toward the sun. My own shadow was nowhere to be seen, though I could feel the heat on my back, and in the water, just beneath the surface, were the shadows of things that weren't there. Boats, people, structures that didn't exist above the waterline. I turned my boat around, paddling hard back the way I'd come, but the channel had changed. Where there had been open water was now choked with salvinia. Passages I'd just navigated were blocked by fallen trees that looked like they'd been there for decades. The swamp was rearranging itself, and I was trapped in its new configuration. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. The sun never seemed to move, stuck in that late afternoon position that makes everything look golden and unreal. I paddled in circles, each channel leading back to that impossible pier, that dead radio that would crackle to life each time I approached, speaking in my voice about last casts and coming home. The whistle on my vest grew heavier with each loop, pulling down like it was made of lead instead of brass. I finally unclipped it, ready to throw it after the tackle box, when I noticed something new etched in the tarnish. A date. Tomorrow's date. That's when the water started to remember. I saw them in the reflections first. Moments that hadn't happened yet, or had happened and been erased. My boat, empty, drifting through the morning mist. My hands, older and scarred, gripping a paddle I didn't recognize. My face, looking up from beneath the water, eyes open and unblinking, mouth moving like it was trying to speak. The paddle marks returned, but now they were everywhere, ahead, behind, crisscrossing in impossible patterns that made my eyes water to follow. The water itself seemed to be rowing, as if the entire swamp had become a vast boat, and I was just cargo. I found myself at the pier again. The radio was speaking in multiple versions of my voice now, past and present and future all arguing about when the last cast had been, or would be. The tackle box was back, completely dry, arranged with even more alien precision, and tied to the pier's pilings, bobbing in water that shouldn't have been deep enough, were boats. Dozens of them, all aluminum, all with Louisiana registration numbers, all with single paddles laid across the seats. In one of them, barely visible through the algae and barnacles, I could make out a registration number I recognized. It was mine, but the prefix was wrong, from a decade that hadn't happened yet. I tied my boat to the pier with shaking hands, not because I wanted to, but because my hands were moving on their own, following some muscle memory that hadn't formed yet. The whistle was burning cold against my chest, the date etched in it seeming to pulse with each heartbeat. The radio static cleared for a moment, and I heard something that wasn't my voice at all. It was older, raspier, like mine might sound in 20 or 30 years. "You can't keep doing this, Tommy. Every loop, you forget a little more. Every cast takes you further from shore." I looked at my hands. They were my hands, but also not. Scars I didn't remember getting, calluses in the wrong places, a wedding ring on a finger where I hadn't worn one in 10 years. The tackle box opened on its own, and inside, the lures had rearranged themselves into words. "You've been here before." The swamp was breathing now, a slow inhale and exhale that moved the boats in unison. The Spanish moss swayed without wind, and beneath the water, those impossible shadows grew darker, more defined. I could almost make out faces in them, all turned up toward the surface, all with their mouths open in silent screams or songs. I tried to leave, untied my boat, pushed off from the pier, paddled until my arms burned and my back screamed. But every channel led back. Every turn brought me to that same clearing, that same pier, that same radio speaking in voices that were all mine from different whens. The sun finally started to set, but it was setting in the wrong direction, sinking into the east while the shadows stretched toward it like fingers. The water turned the color of old blood, and in it, I could see more reflections, not of what was, but of what would be or had been or was happening in some other version of this moment. I saw myself, older, teaching someone to fish from this very pier. Saw myself younger, building the pier with hands that knew exactly where each board should go. Saw myself as I was now, watching myself in an infinite recursion that made my brain feel like it was splitting apart. The whistle started to warm against my chest. When I looked at it, the date was changing, cycling through days and months and years like a slot machine. Each date that appeared brought a flash of memory that wasn't mine yet, casting off from docks that hadn't been built, guiding clients who hadn't been born, pulling in fish that had evolved into something else entirely. The radio spoke in a chorus of my voices now. Last cast, first cast, only cast, always cast. I understood then, with the clarity that comes from accepting the impossible. The swamp didn't just remember, it remembered everything that would be, everything that could be. And somehow, I was caught in its memory, a temporal eddy where past and future spiraled around a single moment that kept repeating, kept forgetting, kept remembering. The pier was mine, had always been mine, would always be mine. Built by hands I hadn't grown into yet, in a time that hadn't happened, for a purpose I'd already forgotten. The tackle box was organized for fishing, but not for fish, for moments, for possibilities, for the things that swam in the spaces between seconds. I sat on the pier as darkness fell upward, from the water instead of down from the sky. The boats around me began to fill with shadows of people I might have been, could have been, would be. All of them had my face at different ages. All of them were checking tackle boxes arranged in that same alien logic. All of them were listening to radios that spoke in their own voices about last casts. The whistle's date finally stopped spinning, landing on a day that felt both impossibly distant and already past. When I put it to my lips and blew, no sound came out. Or rather, the sound came out in a different when, echoing backward and forward through time, until it became the white noise on the radio, the static that had always been there, waiting. I'm still there, on that pier that doesn't exist. Or I'm not there yet, or I've already left. The swamp remembers all of it, holds all of it, like water holds reflections of things that have passed over it. Sometimes I'm the guide, sometimes I'm the client, sometimes I'm the fish being pulled from water that remembers being air. The paddle marks still appear, because I'm making them, will make them, have made them. They follow my boat because they're leading it. describing circles through time that spiral tighter with each loop, approaching a center that's always one cast away. My tackle box is still organized wrong, but I'm beginning to understand the pattern. It's not for catching things, but for releasing them. Memories that haven't formed, futures that won't happen, presents that never quite were. Each lure is a possibility, each hook a choice unmade, each line a path not taken that nevertheless leads back to this pier, this moment, this eternal last cast. The radio still speaks in my voice, all my voices, telling stories of fishing trips that happen in parallel worlds where the water flows backward and fish remember being birds. Sometimes I answer it and sometimes it answers me, and sometimes we're the same voice split across decades, harmonizing with ourselves in a song that sounds like static to anyone who hasn't been caught in the swamp's memory. I know I should be frightened. Part of me, the part that still remembers linear time, is terrified. But mostly, I'm curious. The swamp has been remembering me long before I was born, will remember me long after I'm gone, is remembering me in this eternal now where every cast is both first and last. The sun rises in the west and sets in the east, or perhaps it's the other way around, or perhaps it does both simultaneously. The shadows have shadows of their own now, recursive silhouettes that suggest dimensions I can't quite see. And in the water, always in the water, those paddle marks appear. Perfect parallel lines that lead everywhere and nowhere, following and followed. The swamp's way of rowing itself through time. Tomorrow, I'll wake up at the public dock, about to scout new fishing spots. I'll find the whistle that's already on my vest, see the paddle marks that I'm about to make. I'll follow them to this pier that I built in a future I've already lived. Organize my tackle box in patterns that make perfect sense once you understand that time flows in eddies and currents just like water. Or maybe that was yesterday. Or maybe it's happening right now, has always been happening, will always be happening, in the spaces between heartbeats where the swamp keeps all its memories and futures and might-have-beens. The bayou doesn't forget. Now I understand what my grandfather meant. It doesn't forget because everything that happens here is still happening, always happening, caught in the amber of its dark water and heavy air, and I'm part of that memory now, rowing my parallel lines through time, approaching and departing from a pier that exists in the maybe, casting lines for things that swim in the never was. The whistle hangs heavy on my vest, its date a blur of all dates and no date. When I blow it, I hear the echo coming from before I've blown it, a sound that travels backward through cause and effect until it becomes the catalyst for its own creation. I am the guide and the guided, the fisher and the fished, the one who rows and the one who watches paddle marks appear. The swamp remembers me remembering it, remembering me, an Ouroboros of memory that tastes like copper and marsh grass, that sounds like static and my own voice, that feels like coming home to a place I've never left, will never leave, am always leaving. The last cast has been made. The last cast will be made. The last cast is being made, now and forever, in the Louisiana wetlands where time pools like water in the footprints of cypress trees, where every reflection shows a different when, where the paddle marks lead forward into the past and backward into the future. I'm still there. I have never been there. I am on my way there now, following marks I'm making, finding whistles I've placed, organizing tackle boxes according to the logic of the never quite was. The bayou doesn't forget. Neither do I. Not anymore. Story 2. The fluorescent lights in the control room always flickered at 2:47 a.m. I'd been working the night shift for 3 years, long enough to memorize every electrical quirk in the system, every grinding sound the tracks made when the temperature dropped below 40. But tonight, something was different. The flicker lasted 17 seconds instead of the usual 3. I checked my watch, a habit I'd developed after too many nights blurring together in the perpetual artificial twilight of the subway tunnels. The digital display read 2:48, then stuttered backward to 2:47 for a moment before correcting itself. I rubbed my eyes. Double shifts were getting to me. The radio crackled. Control to Night Operator 7. We're showing an anomaly on track 4B. Can you check it out? Track 4B, the abandoned stretch that hadn't seen service since the 80s. I grabbed my flashlight and safety vest, the familiar weight of routine settling over my shoulders like armor against the unease creeping up my spine. The maintenance door to the abandoned section required 3 keys and a code that changed monthly. As I turned the last lock, a burst of static erupted from the overhead speakers. Speakers that shouldn't have had power. Then, clear as day, came the automated announcement. Stand clear of the closing doors, please. A pause. Welcome aboard, Night Operator 7. Another pause. Next stop, your destination. My hand froze on the door handle. In 20 years of recorded announcements, they'd never used employee designations. Never addressed anyone directly. I pushed through anyway. Anomalies needed documentation, and I wasn't about to let some electrical ghost story spook me out of my job. The tunnel stretched before me, a throat of darkness that my flashlight could only partially illuminate. The air tasted different here, metallic, with an undertone of something organic, like wet newspapers left to rot. My footsteps echoed wrong, each sound arriving back to my ears a half-second late, as if the tunnel itself was reconsidering whether to acknowledge my presence. 50 yards in, I found the first map. It was scratched directly into the tile wall, crude but deliberate. The familiar spiderweb of New York's subway lines, but wrong. Lines that didn't exist branched off at impossible angles. Stations I'd never heard of dotted the imaginary routes. Perdition Square, the Underneath, Temporal Junction. And there, at the convergence of 7 phantom lines, someone had carved Platform E in letters that looked fresh despite the decades of grime surrounding them. My flashlight beam wavered. No, I was wavering. The exhaustion was getting to me. I steadied myself against the wall, and that's when I noticed my watch. 3:03 a.m. As I stared, the display flickered. 3:03, 3:03, 3:04. The minute had repeated. The speakers crackled to life again. Attention passengers. For your safety, please remain behind the yellow line. My name, my actual name, not my operator designation, whispered between the words like wind through a crack. The next train arrives at the beginning. I should have left then. Every instinct I'd developed in 3 years of night work screamed at me to turn around, file a report about electrical malfunction, and forget this tunnel existed. Instead, I walked deeper. The second map appeared on a maintenance panel, this one drawn in what looked like grease pencil. The same impossible routes, but with additions, timestamps next to each station. Past dates, future dates, and one circled frantically. My birthday. Not the day and month, but the complete date, year included. The year I was born. My flashlight died. No, that wasn't right. It was on, 30 feet ahead of me, lying on the tracks with its beam pointing at something on the wall. But I was holding my flashlight. I could feel its weight in my hand, could see my fingers wrapped around it in the darkness. Yet there it was, impossibly illuminating a service poster from 1987. "Subway safety begins with you," the poster declared in faded yellow letters. Below, in handwriting I recognized as my own, despite never having been here before. Inaugural run, Platform E, Operator 7, reporting for first shift. The date on the poster matched my birth date exactly. My watch showed 3:03 again. This time, I counted. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, all the way to 60. Then 70, 90. At 120 seconds, the display finally clicked over to 3:04, then immediately back to 3:03. The speakers burst to life with such violence that I stumbled, nearly falling onto the third rail. Overlapping announcements in different decades of recording quality created a cacophony of instructions. Mind the gap between the train and the platform. Please offer your seat to elderly passengers. Welcome to your shift, Operator 7. You have always been here. The E-train is now arriving. The E-train has always been arriving. I ran toward my flashlight, the one lying on the tracks, but the distance never closed. Each step forward moved me nowhere, like running on a treadmill. The beam remained 30 feet ahead, an unreachable lighthouse in the tunnel's belly. My legs burned, my chest heaved, but the flashlight never got closer. Then I heard the rumble. Subway workers know every sound the system makes. This wasn't one of them. Too deep, too organic, like breathing through a massive throat. The tracks began to vibrate with a rhythm that didn't match any train schedule. In the distance, impossible to tell how far in the acoustic chaos of the tunnel, I saw lights. Not the harsh headlights of a train, but something softer, older. Gas lamps. Dozens of them, approaching in a line. The third map materialized under my feet, literally under them, glowing through the grime as if lit from below. This one was different. It showed only one line, one route, starting at a station labeled with my birth date and ending at Platform E. Along the route, dates of every shift I'd ever worked, thousands of them, led like breadcrumbs to that final destination. My watch read 3:03. In the distance, my flashlight, the one I was somehow still holding and seeing ahead of me simultaneously, swiveled on its own, the beam tracing letters on the tunnel wall. You never left. The gas lamps were closer now. I could make out shapes between them. Not passengers, not quite. They wore conductor uniforms from different eras, all walking in perfect synchronization. Their faces were turned away, but I knew, with the certainty of dream logic, that if they turned around, I would see my own face on each of them. Older, younger, but mine. The speakers shrieked one final message, my name now fully integrated into the safety announcement. Stand clear of the closing doors. Operator 7, your shift begins at Platform E. You have always been standing clear of the closing doors. You will always be standing clear of the closing doors. I forced myself to turn around, to run back toward the maintenance door. But the tunnel had changed. Where I'd entered was now a solid wall, tiles pristine, as if they'd never known an opening. Scratched into them was a single line. Employees must complete their assigned shifts. The rumbling grew louder. My watch showed 3:03, then 3:03 again. The minutes stretched like taffy, each second subdividing into smaller eternities. In one of those split moments, I saw myself from outside, standing in the tunnel, flashlight in hand, staring at nothing. I saw myself from yesterday, checking track 4B, finding nothing wrong. I saw myself from tomorrow, writing a report about electrical anomalies that never quite captured what I'd experienced. All these versions of me existed simultaneously in the tunnel, each investigating the same anomaly, each discovering Platform E, each realizing the truth at 3:03 a.m. The gas lamps reached me, the figures stopped, still facing away. In unison, they raised their arms and pointed ahead, deeper into the tunnel. My flashlight, both the one in my hand and the one impossible yards ahead, illuminated a sign I hadn't seen before. Platform E, all trains terminate here. Terminate, or originate. In a loop, there was no difference. I walked forward because there was nowhere else to go. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that shouldn't have existed, couldn't have existed given the geography of Manhattan above. Platform E stretched before me, pristine and impossible, its tiles gleaming with fresh installation, despite the impossible age they radiated. A single train waited at the platform. Not modern, not vintage, but somehow both and neither. Its doors stood open. Inside, I could see rows of seats filled with figures in MTA uniforms. They all had their backs to me, heads bowed as if reading something in their laps. The speaker above the train door crackled. This is the final stop on this train. Everyone please leave the train. Welcome to Platform E. I stepped closer. In the reflection of the train's window, I saw my face clearly for the first time since entering the tunnel. But the reflection was wrong. I was wearing a conductor's uniform from the 1950s. My badge showed a higher date of 1953. The face was mine, but older, younger, exactly as it should be. My watch read 3:03. I looked down at my hands. They held a flashlight, but also didn't. They were young, old, calloused from decades of work I hadn't done yet, smooth from shifts that hadn't begun. Every version of myself that had ever walked these tunnels, that would ever walk these tunnels stood in the same spot, making the same choice. The figures in the train slowly began to turn their heads toward me. I knew what I would see. I knew because I was already sitting in one of those seats, had always been sitting there, would always be sitting there. The eternal night shift at Platform E, where time folded in on itself, and every operator who'd ever noticed the anomaly discovered they weren't investigating it. They were it. The maintenance door slammed shut behind me. No, I was closing it from the outside, finishing my shift report. Nothing unusual on track 4B, just electrical ghosts. I filed the paperwork and went home as my watch ticked past 3:04, finally, mercifully. But I was also still in the tunnel, had never left the tunnel, would never leave the tunnel. Platform E existed in the gap between seconds, in the space between the train and the platform that passengers are warned to mind. I was the warning. I was the gap. The next night, Control radioed about an anomaly on track 4B. I grabbed my flashlight, the familiar weight of routine settling over my shoulders. As I turned the last lock on the maintenance door, I heard my own voice echoing from the speakers in the abandoned tunnel. "Welcome aboard, Night Operator 7. Next stop, your destination." I pushed through the door, knowing exactly what I would find, having never been there before, having always been there. My watch read 2:48, then 2:47. The fluorescent lights in the control room flickered for 17 seconds. Somewhere in the tunnels beneath New York, Platform E waits with infinite patience. Its trains run on a schedule that exists between moments, carrying operators who investigate anomalies that they themselves have become. The safety announcements play on a loop, each one personalized, each one true. "Stand clear of the closing doors, please." The doors never close. They never open. We are always standing clear. My name echoes in the space between the words, not a warning, but a roll call. Present. Always present. Never absent from the shift that starts when you notice time stuttering and ends when you realize it never started at all. I file my report. Nothing unusual on track 4B. I investigate the anomaly. I am the anomaly. My watch reads 3:03. Welcome to Platform E. Your shift has already begun. Story 3. The clock in the main hall stopped at 1:19 again. I stood there, toolbox in hand, watching the ornate grandfather clock's hands quiver before snapping back to that exact moment. Always 1:19. Always when I stepped within 6 feet of the fireplace. The third time it happened today, I decided to stop counting. Gray Mountain Lodge had been closed for 3 weeks now. End of season, they called it, though April snow still dusted the peaks visible through the panoramic windows. Just me and 27,000 square feet of empty luxury, keeping the pipes from freezing and the roof from caving in under the weight of late spring storms. The isolation suited me fine, or it had, until the lodge started keeping time by its own rules. I set my toolbox down and approached the fireplace slowly, watching the clock face. The second hand swept normally past 12, past 3, past 6, then jerked backward. 1:19. The chime that should have marked the quarter hour came out wrong, a hollow sound like someone clearing their throat underwater. The wet footprints on the main staircase had dried by now, but I knew they'd return. They always did, right around sunset, appearing one by one as if someone invisible was climbing those stairs with snow-soaked boots. They'd materialize slowly, darkening the burgundy carpet, ascending toward the second floor before vanishing at the third step from the top. No explanation, no source, just water that shouldn't exist marking passage that couldn't happen. I grabbed my toolbox and headed for the electrical room. The resort's owners had left me a list of maintenance tasks long enough to fill 3 months, not 3 weeks, but I'd been working through it methodically. Today's project, checking the backup generators and testing emergency systems. Mindless work that would keep my hands busy while my brain tried to process what my eyes kept seeing. The electrical room sat in the East Wing's basement, accessible through a narrow corridor that always smelled of industrial cleaning solution. and something else. Something organic and sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of greenish white that made my skin look dead. I'd been avoiding the basement since Tuesday, when I'd found my old employee badge in the maintenance closet. The badge shouldn't have been there. I'd never worked at Gray Mountain Lodge before this assignment. I'd never even been to Colorado before taking this job, but there it was, laminated and official. My face, my name, an employee number I didn't recognize, and a hire date from 2019. 5 years ago. Clipped to it was a note in handwriting I almost recognized. Change the basement password before looking through the peephole. The basement door's keypad blinked red when I entered my current code. I tried again. Still red. On the third attempt, my fingers moved without conscious thought, typing 0-1-1-9. The lock disengaged with a satisfied beep. January 19th. Why did I know that? The door opened onto darkness thick enough to have weight. I fumbled for the light switch, found it exactly where my hand expected it to be, though I'd never been down here before. The fluorescence stuttered to life in sequence, illuminating a corridor that stretched further than the building's footprint should have allowed. The walls were concrete, painted that institutional beige that existed nowhere in nature. Pipes ran along the ceiling, wrapped in insulation that looked new despite the manufacture date stamped on it, 1987. My footsteps echoed wrong, not the sharp report of boots on concrete, but something muffled and delayed, as if the sound was taking a longer path to reach my ears. The electrical panels were where they should be, halfway down the corridor on the left. I ran through the checklist: main breakers, subsidiary panels, emergency cutoffs. Everything functioning normally, if you ignored the way the panel labels kept swimming in and out of focus, letters rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. Behind the main panel, barely visible, was a small metal door I hadn't noticed in the blueprints. It had a peephole at eye level, an old-fashioned kind with a brass cover that slid aside. Below it, someone had scratched words into the paint. Don't look, don't. The conflicting instructions made my head hurt. I reached for the brass cover, then remembered the note. Change the password first. But I'd already changed it, hadn't I? When I'd entered 0119, a drop of water hit my shoulder. I looked up to see condensation forming on pipes that shouldn't have been cold enough to sweat. Another drop, then another. The moisture was wrong. Too thick, too warm. When I touched it, my fingers came away pink. I backed away from the door, from the impossible dripping, from the peephole I absolutely was not going to look through. The corridor seemed longer on the way back. The lights went out behind me in sequence, chasing me with darkness. By the time I reached the stairs, I was running. The main hall felt different when I emerged, familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. The furniture was in slightly different positions, or maybe it had always been that way. The clock read 1:19, but now I wasn't anywhere near the fireplace. Through the massive windows, my car sat in the parking lot, but in a different space than where I'd left it. 3 spaces over, facing the wrong direction, covered in a layer of snow that hadn't been there an hour ago. The television in the lounge flickered on. It wasn't plugged in. I disconnected all the electronics as part of the shutdown procedure. The screen showed static for a moment, then cleared to reveal a security camera feed of the parking lot. My car was in its original spot. Then it wasn't. Then it was, but I was standing beside it, looking up at the camera. I raised my hand to wave, and the me on the screen waved back a full second before I moved. The image froze, pixelated, reformed. Now the screen showed the basement corridor. A figure stood at the far end, face obscured by the angle and the harsh fluorescent light. It was wearing my clothes. It approached the peephole door, slid aside the brass cover, and leaned in to look. The screen went dark. In the reflection, I saw myself standing behind me. I spun around. Nobody there. When I turned back to the TV, it was off and unplugged, cord coiled neatly beside it like I'd left it 3 days ago. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You looked, didn't you? I hadn't. I was sure I hadn't. But my left eye was starting to water, and when I touched my cheek, My fingers came away pink. The next 3 days blurred together. I continued my maintenance rounds, but the lodge had developed its own routine around me. The clock's obsession with 1:19 spread to other timepieces. The digital display on the microwave, the timestamps on my phone's photos, even my wristwatch when I got too close to certain rooms. The wet footprints appeared and disappeared on a schedule I couldn't predict, sometimes on the stairs, sometimes tracking across the ceiling, defying gravity and logic with equal indifference. I found more evidence of my impossible employment history. Time cards in a filing cabinet, my signature on inspection logs from years before I'd existed in Colorado, a performance review praising my attention to detail and ability to see what others miss. The review was dated next month. The worst part was how natural it all began to feel. My hands knew which keys opened which locks without checking. I could navigate the building in complete darkness, my feet finding their way around furniture I shouldn't have memorized yet. When I caught myself humming, it was the lodge's heating system's rhythm, a song made of mechanical breathing and electrical hums. On Thursday, I couldn't avoid the basement anymore. The water heater needed inspection, and no amount of dread could change that. This time the corridor was shorter, or I was getting used to its impossible geometry. The peephole door waited where I'd left it, brass cover still closed, contradictory instructions still scratched in the paint. But there was something new, a work order taped below the scratched words, dated tomorrow. Install additional security measures. Previous system compromised by temporal overlap. See reverse for details. I turned the paper over. It was blank except for a single line in my handwriting. I'm already inside. The brass cover on the peephole had been slid open. I didn't remember opening it, but my fingers held the memory of cold metal, the slight resistance as the mechanism moved. Through the hole I should have seen another maintenance corridor, or maybe a storage room. Instead, I saw an eye looking back at me. My eye. Same heterochromia. One brown, one with that ring of green around the pupil that my ex had called unsettling. It blinked when I blinked. Perfect synchronization. Then it winked. I jerked back and heard footsteps. My footsteps. Walking away on the other side of the door. The sound faded, but not with distance. It faded like it was walking into another time. The work order was gone. The brass cover was closed. My reflection in its polished surface showed both my eyes were now that unsettling green. I called the resort management that night, trying to explain without sounding insane that I needed someone else to come check on things, that maybe we should have a second person here, that the isolation was getting to me. The woman who answered sounded confused. She insisted I wasn't scheduled to start until next week. Their current maintenance guy, she said my name, my exact name, had been doing an excellent job, had been there since Monday, was in fact logged into their system right now, filing his daily reports. I hung up and checked my laptop. 3 days of reports I didn't remember writing, detailed accounts of work I'd absolutely done but couldn't recall documenting. The writing style was mine, down to my tendency to use too many commas and my inability to spell necessary correctly on the first try. That night, I decided to stay awake, to watch the parking lot and see if my car really moved. I set up in the lounge with a thermos of coffee and a clear view of the lot. At 1:19 a.m. I must have blinked, because suddenly the car was 3 spaces over. I checked the security footage on my phone. The resort app showed my car had never moved. But in the reflection on my phone screen, I could see it in its new position. The wet footprints appeared at 1:47, starting at the front door this time, tracking snow that didn't exist from a storm that wasn't happening. They led to the lounge where I was sitting, circled my chair twice, then headed back to the door. The final print, just before they disappeared, was facing the wrong direction, toes pointing toward me when they should have pointed away. I gave up on sleep and went to check the generator again, needing the routine of mechanical inspection to ground myself. The basement door's keypad showed an entry at 1:19 a.m. My code, my biometric signature on the newer scanner they'd installed last year. Last year, when I hadn't worked here. Last year, when I'd been in Michigan, fixing wind turbines and definitely not entering basements in Colorado. The corridor was different this time. Shorter or longer I couldn't tell, but certainly different. The pipes above were dry now, but the floor was wet, a thin layer of water that reflected lights that weren't there. My footsteps splashed, but the water didn't ripple. It stayed perfectly still, like walking on solid glass that happened to be wet. The peephole door was open, not the brass cover. The entire door stood ajar, revealing darkness that the corridor's fluorescent lights couldn't penetrate. From inside came a sound like breathing. If breathing could echo, if echoes could happen before the original sound. I knew I shouldn't enter. Every instinct, every shred of self-preservation screamed at me to turn around, go back upstairs, get in my car, whichever spot it was in, and drive away. But my feet knew the way. My hands knew where the light switch would be. My body was already walking into that darkness before my mind could form the word no. Inside was another maintenance corridor, identical to the one I'd just left, except everything was reversed. Writing backwards, pipes running the opposite direction, and at the far end, another peephole door. Through it, I could see myself standing in the original corridor, looking through the first peephole, an infinite regression of maintenance workers, all me, all looking through doors at other versions of ourselves. But we weren't all synchronized. Some versions were seconds ahead, others days behind. I watched myself arrive for the first time, confident and unaware. I watched myself discover the clock's malfunction, find the old badge, type in the code I shouldn't have known. I watched myself leave. Events that hadn't happened yet, or had happened and I'd forgotten, or were happening right now, in spaces that overlapped but didn't quite touch. In one version, I'd been here for years. That me moved through the lodge like he'd built it, knew every pipe and wire, every secret the building kept. He looked older, grayer, wore his exhaustion like a uniform. When he passed the peephole, he glanced through, and our eyes met across whatever impossible distance separated us. He mouthed a single word: run. But I couldn't run. My feet were already walking deeper into the reversed corridor, toward a door marked mechanical room that I knew didn't exist in the real lodge's blueprints. My hand was already reaching for the handle, fingers fitting into grooves worn by years of use I hadn't accumulated yet. The mechanical room was full of clocks, hundreds of them, all stopped at 1:19, all ticking in perfect silence. In the center sat a desk with a single folder labeled Employment History. Inside were photos of me working at the lodge, decades of photos, showing me at different ages, some younger than I was now, some older than I'd ever be. In all of them, I was looking at something just outside the frame, my expression caught between recognition and horror. The last photo showed me sitting at this desk, looking at this folder, with someone standing behind me. I turned around. The room was empty, but wet footprints circled my chair. They were still forming, water materializing from nowhere, tracking movement that was happening in another layer of this twisted space. The prints stopped directly behind me, toes pointing at my back. I felt breath on my neck that matched my own breathing. When I inhaled, it inhaled. When I held my breath, the sensation stopped. I was haunting myself, or being haunted by myself, or both simultaneously in a loop that had neither beginning nor end. The folder had changed while I wasn't looking. Now it contained a single sheet of paper, a work order dated today or yesterday or tomorrow. The date kept shifting. Repair temporal leak in basement. Note, employee already on site. I laughed. I couldn't help it. The sound echoed wrong, bouncing off walls that weren't quite where they should be, returning to my ears as something between a sob and a scream. When I finally left the mechanical room, the corridor had multiplied. 3 paths now led away from the door, each one identical except for the quality of light. One fluorescent white, one emergency red, one the golden glow of flames that shouldn't exist in a concrete basement. Down the flame-lit path, I could see myself working on the generator, movements efficient and practiced. Down the red path I was running, something unseen chasing me through corridors that branched and multiplied into a labyrinth. Down the white path, I was walking toward myself, matching my pace perfectly, growing closer with each step. I chose none of them. Instead, I sat down right there, back against the mechanical room door and closed my eyes. If I was going to go insane, I could at least do it sitting down. That's when I heard my own voice, coming from the other side of the door. The first few weeks are the hardest. After that, you stop noticing the inconsistencies. After a year, you stop caring. After 5 years, you forget there was ever a different way for time to work. I opened my eyes. I was sitting in the lounge, morning sunlight streaming through the windows. My car was in its original spot. The clock on the wall read 8:47, and when I watched, the second hand moved normally, steadily. No jumping back to 1:19. My phone showed 3 missed calls from the resort management, concerned because I hadn't filed my reports for the past 2 days. 2 days I didn't remember losing. When I checked my laptop, the reports were there, completed and submitted, time-stamped during hours I couldn't account for. I wanted to leave. Every rational part of me screamed to pack up, drive away, never look back. But when I stood up, my feet carried me to the supply closet instead. My hands grabbed cleaning supplies, tools, the everyday implements of maintenance work. My body knew the routine, even if my mind was still catching up to the reality that I'd been here far longer than 3 weeks, or would be here, or had been here in iterations that existed parallel to this one. The wet footprints were back on the stairs. This time, they continued past the 3rd step, all the way to the landing, where they turned and faced the wall. There was a door there I hadn't noticed before, or hadn't been there before, plain white, unmarked, with a peephole at eye level. I didn't need to look. I knew what I'd see. Another eye, my eye, looking back from another angle of this impossible space. We were all here, all the versions of me, maintaining a lodge that existed in too many times at once, keeping it running for guests who would arrive in timelines that overlapped but never quite aligned. The realization settled over me like a familiar coat. I wasn't going insane. I was already insane, or had been, or would be. Or maybe this was sanity, and everything else had been the delusion. When you work in a place where effect precedes cause, where you can meet yourself coming and going, where the building remembers you before you arrive, what's the difference between madness and adaptation? I filed my report that night, fingers typing words that felt both foreign and familiar. Tomorrow, I would check the generator again. I would find evidence of work I'd already done, or would do, or was doing in another fold of this temporal origami. The clock would stop at 1:19, and I would note it in the log, and another version of me would read that note and understand that he wasn't the first or the last. The lodge needed maintaining, all of it, in all its iterations, in all its times. And I was the man for the job. Had always been, would always be. Before going to my room, the staff quarters I'd never been assigned but somehow had a key for, I stopped at the basement door one last time. The keypad accepted my code as it always had, as it always would. The corridor stretched ahead, impossibly long and terrifyingly familiar. At the far end, I could see the peephole door, brass cover gleaming in the fluorescent light. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to it, slid aside the cover and looked through. On the other side was an eye, brown with that ring of green around the pupil. It blinked when I blinked. Then we both winked, in perfect synchronization, an acknowledgement between iterations. We were all here, all maintaining our corners of this broken space, all keeping the lodge running through seasons that cycled outside of normal time. I slid the brass cover closed and walked back to the stairs. Behind me, wet footprints appeared in my wake, following my path in reverse, as if I was walking backward while moving forward. The paradox didn't bother me anymore. Nothing about this place bothered me anymore, or it all bothered me so much that the feeling had inverted into something like comfort. The clock in the main hall read 1:19 when I passed it. It always would. Story 4. The dust hadn't settled right since I arrived in Copper Springs 3 days ago. It hung in the air like suspended mathematics, defying the calculations I'd spent 15 years perfecting. My theodolite confirmed what my eyes refused to accept. Particles hovering at impossible angles, creating geometries that shouldn't exist outside of fever dreams. I'd taken the job because abandoned towns were my specialty. Insurance companies needed documentation, state agencies required surveys, and I needed the solitude. Copper Springs had been dead for 40 years, another Nevada mining town that bled out when the ore did. The contract specified a complete topographical assessment, property boundaries, structural integrity reports. Routine work for someone who preferred the company of transit levels to people. But routine ended the morning I found Maple Avenue where Desert Road should have been. My base camp sat in what used to be the town square, my equipment trailer positioned with GPS precision at coordinates I'd triple-checked before accepting the contract. The first 2 days had progressed normally. Methodical measurements, careful documentation, the satisfying click of my equipment as it captured angles and distances. I'd mapped the eastern quadrant, noting the predictable decay patterns of buildings surrendering to time and desert wind. The third morning brought wrongness with the sunrise. The street signs I'd cataloged the previous evening had rearranged themselves like words in a sentence I wasn't meant to read. Maple Avenue, the street where I'd grown up in Ohio, where my mother still lived until the cancer took her, stretched before me in the Nevada desert. The oxidized sign creaked in windless air, its green paint peeling in patterns I recognized from childhood nightmares about getting lost on the way home from school. My equipment confirmed the impossibility. The GPS showed my location unchanged, but the street layout had shifted. Not dramatically, subtle enough that I might have missed it without my surveyor's obsession for precision. Buildings had rotated degrees that made no architectural sense. The old post office faced southeast instead of south. The foundation of what had been a general store had migrated 6 feet west, leaving undisturbed earth where concrete should have torn away. I recalibrated everything twice. The instruments functioned perfectly, which made their readings worse. My digital level began displaying negative incline on perfectly flat ground, the numbers descending into mathematical impossibilities. -3 degrees, -7, -12, as if the earth itself was tilting into dimensions my training hadn't prepared me for. The saloon stood at the intersection of Maple, and what my morning notes insisted was Jefferson Street, another ghost from my past, from the apartment complex where I'd lived during my divorce. The building had no door, just a doorway that seemed to swallow light. My laser distance meter couldn't find the back wall. The beam simply disappeared into architectural void. Professional curiosity overrode the crawling sensation between my shoulder blades. I'd documented structural anomalies before. Desert heat could warp perception, create mirages that fooled even experienced eyes. This was explainable. Everything was explainable with enough data. Inside, the air tasted of copper pennies and old photographs. Dust motes hung motionless despite my movement, each particle a tiny star in the bar's twilight. The floorboards groaned with mathematical precision, every third step producing a sound that registered at exactly 347 hertz on my phone's frequency analyzer. I'd tested it 3 times, the same impossible consistency each time. The bar's surface was cleared of decades of dust in one spot, revealing wood grain that spiraled in patterns that hurt to follow. Placed there, as if waiting, lay an antique folding ruler, the kind surveyors used before digital tools made them obsolete. Brass fittings green with age, wood worn smooth by unknown hands. I picked it up with the careful reverence reserved for historical artifacts. The ruler unfolded in segments, each marked with standard measurements until I reached the 3rd section. There, etched with disturbing precision, were measurements that corresponded exactly to my left leg. Not approximately, exactly, 34.7 inches from hip joint to ankle. The precise circumference at 3 different points. The old injury from college track that left my fibula 2 millimeters shorter than standard. These measurements existed nowhere, except my medical records, and my own obsessive self-documentation. I'd measured that discrepancy myself, years ago, during a period when understanding my body's imperfections felt like control over a life spiraling toward divorce. The ruler felt warm in my hands, pulsing with heat that had no source in the saloon's shadowed interior. When I tried to photograph it, My camera displayed error messages in languages that shifted between English and something that looked like coordinates pretending to be words. Outside, the sun had moved wrong. My shadow fell at an angle that suggested 3 hours had passed, but my watch insisted on 20 minutes. The street signs had shifted again, now showing Riverside Drive, where I'd had my first apartment after college. The building where I'd kissed my ex-wife for the first time stood in perfect detail where a collapsed mining office had been that morning, down to the crack in the third step where she'd caught her heel. My equipment trailer remained where I'd left it, but my instruments had been precisely rearranged. Each tool rotated exactly 15 degrees clockwise, positioned with surveying accuracy that would have taken me an hour to achieve. The GPS unit was on, despite being powered down when I'd left. On its screen, a saved waypoint I hadn't created. Vol.134, return alone in Portuguese. I didn't speak Portuguese. I'd never saved waypoints in any language but English. The coordinates led deeper into town, toward the mining complex I'd planned to survey the next day. My rational mind cataloged explanations. Pranks, carbon monoxide from old mine shafts affecting perception, dehydration manifesting as paranoia, but my hands shook as I noted the measurements in my field book, watching my handwriting deteriorate from precise documentation to something resembling the frantic scratches I'd seen in abandoned miners' journals. The path to the coordinates wound through streets that shouldn't exist. Each turn revealed another fragment of my geographical past. Elm Court from my grandmother's neighborhood, Industrial Way from the summer I'd worked construction to pay for surveying school. The buildings were perfect in their wrongness. Familiar structures wearing Nevada decay like an ill-fitting costume. My equipment grew heavier with each step, though the scale in my trailer had shown no weight change. The theodolite's eyepiece kept fogging despite the desert air's zero humidity. When I cleaned it, the condensation left patterns on my lens cloth that looked like topographical maps of places I'd never been but somehow recognized. The waypoint led to a structure that hadn't appeared on any historical survey. A small concrete building, possibly a pump house, with walls that met at angles my transit couldn't quite capture. Each measurement yielded different results, as if the building existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and my equipment could only capture one at a time. Inside, the walls were covered with survey markers, brass caps, concrete monuments, section corners. Hundreds of them, possibly thousands, each one identical to markers I'd personally placed throughout my career. The marker from the Riverside Mall project, the one from the highway expansion that had cost me my marriage when I'd chosen the job over couples counseling, each carrying tiny imperfections only I would recognize. A scratch here, a specific wear pattern there. In the center of the room, a surveyor's chain lay coiled in a perfect spiral. Not just any chain, my grandfather's, the one destroyed in a warehouse fire 10 years ago. I recognized every link, every repair, down to the bend in the 7th link from the handle where I dropped it during my first solo survey. The chain was warm, almost alive, and when I touched it, I heard the sound of measuring. Not the act of measurement, but the sound itself, the whisper of distance being reduced to numbers, of space being transformed into data. It grew louder, filling my skull with the accumulated noise of every measurement ever taken, every boundary ever drawn, every line ever surveyed, stretching back through generations of surveyors to the first human who looked at land and decided to divide it into ownable pieces. I ran. Professionalism, curiosity, rational thought, all abandoned in the face of that sound. My equipment remained behind as I sprinted through streets that rearranged themselves with each turn. Compass readings spun without pattern. North became a suggestion rather than a direction. My GPS displayed coordinates that placed me simultaneously in Nevada, Ohio, and nowhere that existed on any map I'd ever seen. The sun was setting when I reached my truck, though my watch claimed it was noon. My hands fumbled with keys that felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else's life. The engine started with reluctance, the sound wrong in ways I couldn't define, too loud and too quiet simultaneously, as if existing at frequencies human ears weren't meant to perceive. As I drove toward the town's edge, my rearview mirror showed Copper Springs folding in on itself, streets collapsing into mathematical impossibilities. buildings rotating through dimensions that made my surveyor's mind scream. The last thing I saw was my equipment trailer, still positioned at those precise coordinates, but now it was surrounded by survey markers, thousands of them, spreading across the desert like metallic flowers, each one bearing my personal identification number, each one a boundary I'd never drawn, but somehow remembered placing. The highway appeared after what felt like hours, but what my odometer claimed was 3 miles. Real asphalt, real center lines, real mile markers counting toward Las Vegas. I pulled over at the first gas station, hands shaking too badly to continue driving. The bathroom mirror showed my face, but wrong, aged in ways that suggested years rather than days, with dust in the creases that wouldn't wash out no matter how hard I scrubbed. My phone had 37 missed calls from the contracting agency. When I called back, they claimed I'd been gone for 3 weeks. The contract had been canceled. Another surveyor sent to find me had reported that Copper Springs didn't exist. Satellite imagery showed only empty desert where the town should have been, where I knew it had been, where my equipment still was, according to the GPS tracker that showed impossible coordinates my map software couldn't process. I drove home to Reno in silence, the radio producing only static that occasionally resolved into what sounded like measurements being read aloud in voices I almost recognized. My apartment felt foreign, as if I was trespassing in someone else's life. Survey maps covered my walls, projects I'd completed, boundaries I'd established. But now they seemed wrong, as if every measurement I'd ever taken was off by some tiny but crucial amount. The ruler from the saloon was in my jacket pocket, though I'd left it behind in the panic. It felt heavier now, dense with accumulated measurements. When I unfolded it, new marks had appeared. Measurements of my apartment, my truck, the distance from my door to the elevator, measurements taken from inside the spaces, as if something was surveying my life from within the boundaries I'd created. My computer contained files I didn't remember creating. Survey data from Copper Springs, but not the town I'd visited. These measurements showed a different place, one where the streets aligned with mathematical perfection, where every angle was precise, where boundaries existed not between properties, but between realities. The metadata claimed I'd created these files over the course of 15 years, one measurement per day, building towards something I couldn't understand. Sleep brought dreams of endless surveying, of measuring distances that grew longer with each measurement, of boundaries that moved when observed. I woke to find my surveying equipment neatly arranged in my living room, cleaned and calibrated, though everything had been abandoned in Copper Springs. The GPS unit was on, displaying a message. Survey incomplete. Return alone to finish. I've tried to return to normal work, but my measurements are wrong now. Every survey I attempt shows impossible results. Negative distances, recursive boundaries, properties that overlap themselves. Other surveyors check my work and find it perfect, but I see the errors, the places where reality doesn't quite align with itself, the spaces between measurements where something else exists, watching through the gaps in the data. 3 months have passed. The messages on my GPS are more insistent. My equipment turns on at night, calibrating itself, preparing for work I haven't assigned. The ruler grows heavier, accumulating measurements of places I haven't been, distances I haven't traveled. Sometimes I catch glimpses in my peripheral vision, survey markers appearing in impossible places. The corner of my bedroom, the middle of the shower wall, floating in the air above my desk, brass gleaming with purpose I can't comprehend. I know I'll return to Copper Springs, not because I want to, but because the survey must be completed. That's what surveyors do. We complete the job, we establish the boundaries, we reduce the infinite to the measurable. But I'm beginning to understand that some boundaries aren't meant to define space. They define the surveyor, measuring not the land, but the person who dares to divide infinity into ownable pieces. My equipment is already packed. The coordinates are programmed. The ruler pulses with warmth in my pocket, eager to unfold into dimensions I'm not prepared to measure. Tomorrow, I'll drive back to Nevada, to the town that doesn't exist, to finish a survey that began long before I accepted the contract. This time I'll go alone, as the GPS demands. Because now I understand, I was never measuring Copper Springs. Copper Springs was measuring me. And the survey isn't complete until every dimension of my existence has been cataloged, documented, and filed away in the vast archive of boundaries that define not just where we are, but who we are, and what happens when we discover that the most important boundaries are the ones we never knew existed. The dust still hasn't settled right. It never will again. Story 5. The gas detector's rhythm had become my heartbeat. 3 short beeps, 3 long, 3 short again. I'd been hearing it for the past hour as I made my rounds through the abandoned Blackwood mine, and something about the pattern gnawed at the edges of my consciousness like rust on old metal. The November wind howled through the entrance behind me, carrying the scent of dead leaves and something else, something metallic and wrong that made my teeth ache. I adjusted the beam of my flashlight, watching it cut through the perpetual darkness that seemed to eat light rather than simply exist in its absence. The company had hired me 6 months ago to keep squatters and scrappers out, but lately, I'd begun to wonder what exactly I was keeping in. The detector beeped again. Short, short, short. Long, long, long. Short, short, short. My hand trembled as I pulled out my notebook, the pages already yellowed despite being new last week. In the weak circle of light, I traced the pattern with my pen. The realization hit me like cold water in the lungs. It wasn't random. It was Morse code. SOS? No, wait, I counted again, timing the intervals differently. UP. The machine was beeping UP over and over. I looked around the gallery where I stood, my flashlight beam dancing across the rough-hewn walls. The main tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, but to my left, barely visible behind a rusted equipment cart, was the entrance to Shaft 7, a vertical drop that descended into the lower levels, or ascended, depending on your perspective. But there was no ladder, no elevator, nothing. Just a perfectly circular hole boring through solid rock, edges smooth as glass. The detector's beeping intensified, and now I could hear it clearly. Up. 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 I approached the shaft, my boots crunching on the gravel. That's when I saw them, footprints in the thick dust. Fresh ones. The tread pattern was achingly familiar, and when I placed my boot next to one, it matched perfectly, except for one detail that made my stomach clench. The wear pattern was reversed. Where my right boot showed heavy wear on the inside edge from my slight pronation, these prints wore heavily on the outside. Mirror images. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. Static filled the tunnel for 3 seconds before a voice emerged. My voice, reading a report. Gallery C7 clear, no signs of entry. Water seepage in the northeast corner increasing. Recommend structural assessment ASAP. This is signing off at 0:23:50 hours. But I hadn't filed that report. I glanced at my watch. 11:47 p.m. Those were my abbreviations, though. ASAP instead of as soon as possible, my particular way of noting compass directions. Even the pause before signing off, a habit I'd developed to remember to state my badge number but always forgot anyway. The radio died. The detector continued its mechanical mantra. Up. 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 I backed away from the shaft, my light catching something on the wall. Scratches in the rock that looked fresh. No, not scratches. Writing. My handwriting, carved deep into the stone. The only way out is through. My hands shook as I photographed it with my phone. The screen flickered, showing the image for a split second before corrupting into pixels of static. When it cleared, the photo showed the same wall, but the message was different. The only way through is out. A metallic taste filled my mouth. The air grew thick, oppressive, like breathing through wet wool. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in seconds, and my breath came out in clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should, forming shapes that almost looked like faces before dissipating. My radio buzzed again. This time, dispatch came through clearly. Unit 3, please confirm inspection of Gallery N2. Your signature is on the sheet, but we need verbal confirmation. Gallery N2. I'd memorized every inch of this mine's layout over the past 6 months. There was no Gallery N2, The designations jumped from N1 to N3, something about unstable geology that prevented that section from ever being excavated. Unit 3, do you copy? The paperwork shows you signed off on N2 at 2000 hours. I pulled out my inspection log. There in my handwriting was an entry I hadn't made. Gallery N2, all clear. No anomalies detected. JH, my initials, my handwriting. The ink still looked wet. The detector's beeping grew frantic now, the pattern shifting. Up now. UPNOW. UPNOW. I stumbled backward, my light swinging wildly. In the chaos of shadows and light, I saw something that made my blood crystallize. A figure standing at the edge of Shaft 7. It wore my uniform, carried my model flashlight, had my build, my posture, but when it turned its head slightly, I saw its face in profile, and it was like looking at myself through water, features right but somehow fundamentally wrong, as if someone had tried to reconstruct my face from memory and gotten the proportions off by millimeters. It raised its hand and waved. I felt my own hand twitch, wanting to wave back. The radio crackled. Unit 3 responding. Gallery N2 inspection complete. No issues to report. My voice, but I hadn't spoken. The figure at the shaft turned fully toward me now. Its face was mine, but the eyes were wrong. Not in color or shape, but in something deeper. They reflected light differently, like a nocturnal animal's eyes, creating twin points of greenish luminescence in the darkness. It smiled with my mouth, and I noticed its teeth were perfect mirrors of mine, including the chip on my left incisor from a childhood accident, but on the opposite side. You should go up, it said, and hearing my voice come from outside my body made my skin crawl like insects burrowing beneath the surface. The shift's almost over. I checked my watch again. It read 3:33 a.m. That couldn't be right. It had been 11:47 just minutes ago, but my phone showed the same time. Somehow, I'd lost nearly 4 hours. The detector had gone silent. The sudden absence of beeping was worse than the noise itself, creating a vacuum that seemed to pull at my eardrums. In that silence, I heard something else. Breathing that wasn't mine, coming from everywhere and nowhere, in rhythm with my heartbeat but half a second delayed, like an echo of my own life force. Gallery N2 needs inspection, the other me said, gesturing toward a section of wall that looked solid. You've already signed for it. As it spoke, the wall began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. Through the distortion, I could make out an opening that hadn't been there before, or had always been there but I couldn't see it. The entrance to Gallery N2 yawned before me, impossibly black even for this place, as if it existed in a spectrum my flashlight couldn't penetrate. I found myself walking toward it. Each step felt both voluntary and compelled, as if I was following a script I'd written but couldn't remember writing. The other me fell into step beside me, our footfalls perfectly synchronized. In my peripheral vision, I could see it matching my movements exactly, every shift of weight, every swing of the arms, every turn of the head. Do you remember your first day? It asked, conversationally. You thought you heard someone calling your name from the lower levels. You almost went to investigate. I did remember, but I'd never told anyone about that. You did investigate, it continued. You just don't remember coming back up. Time works differently down there. Up here, wherever here, is relative to there. We reached the entrance to Gallery N2. The darkness inside seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like a living thing. My flashlight beam simply stopped at the threshold, as if the passage was filled with black velvet that absorbed all light. The company hired you 6 months ago, the other me said, but check your phone, check your messages, check anything with a date. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my phone. The date showed November 15th, 2024, but when I opened my messages, they were all dated November 15th, 2023. My photos, my emails, everything was a year off, or the phone's clock was. Or, time isn't linear in the deep places, it said. You've been doing this job for 6 months. You've been doing it for 18 months. You've never started. You've already finished. All of these are true. The entrance to Gallery N2 pulled at me. Not physically, but something deeper, like magnetism for consciousness. I could feel thoughts that weren't quite mine forming in my head. Memories of walking these passages before, of signing inspection sheets for galleries that didn't exist, of conversations with versions of myself that wore different faces, but the same bones. The detector wasn't saying up, the other me explained, its voice growing distant even though it stood right beside me. In the deep places, up and down lose meaning. It was saying us. There are so many of us down here, all checking the same galleries, all signing the same sheets, all hearing the same calls. I looked down at my inspection log. Every page was filled with my handwriting, documenting inspections of galleries I'd never seen, N2, S15, W9, designations that made no sense with the mine's actual layout. But I remembered writing each entry, and I also remembered not writing them. Both memories existed simultaneously, equally real, equally false. The radio crackled one more time. All units be advised. Security guard position at Blackwood Mine has been vacant for 6 months. Reposting job listing tomorrow. Vacant? I whispered. Vacant, the other me agreed. Has been since the last guard went to investigate Gallery N2. Or will be, once you do. Or always was, because you already have. I stood at the threshold, 1 foot raised to step inside. In the reflection of my phone screen, I saw myself standing behind myself, and behind that, another, and another, an infinite regression of security guards, all frozen in the same moment of decision. The detector started beeping again, but now I understood the pattern. It wasn't Morse code. It was a heartbeat, multiple heartbeats, all slightly out of sync, all mine, all pounding out the rhythm of lives lived in parallel, each one real, each one impossible. I took the step. Or I didn't, or I'm still standing there, foot raised, caught between breath and breath, between heartbeat and heartbeat, between one version of myself and all the others, forever about to enter Gallery N2, forever having already entered, forever never having existed at all. The inspection sheet for Gallery N2 has my signature. It's dated tomorrow. It's dated last year. The ink is wet. The ink is so old it's fading. When they find this account, if they find it, when they've already found it, when they never will, they'll say the mine's been closed for a decade. They'll say it's been operational this whole time. They'll say there was never a mine here at all. Just a story people tell about a security guard who went to check on something that wasn't there and found himself instead. Or lost himself. Or became himself. Multiplied into infinity. Each version checking galleries that exist only for him, in a mine that's abandoned and active and never was, all at once. The detector is still beeping. It's been silent for years. I can hear it calling. Up. US. Up. US. I'm going to check Gallery N2 now. I've already checked it. I've never left. My replacement will arrive soon. He's already here. He's me. The only way out is through. The only way through is out. Both are true. Neither leads anywhere but back to the beginning, where I'm standing at the edge of Shaft 7, watching my footprints appear in dust that's been undisturbed for decades, signing my name on papers that don't exist, listening to my voice on a radio that's been silent since the mine closed, or opened, or never was. The flashlight beam flickers. In the darkness between pulses of light, I see myself clearly for the first time, all of myselves, checking their galleries, making their rounds, existing in their own slices of time that overlap and contradict and somehow coexist in this place, where the Earth's weight has compressed not just coal but reality itself into something dense and impossible and true. Tomorrow, someone will find this account. Yesterday, someone already has. Today, it's being written. Today, it was never written at all. The detector beeps. Up. Or maybe it's saying, US. Or maybe it's just the sound a heart makes when it beats in too many bodies at once, in a mind that exists in too many states at once, where the only constant is the signature on a sheet for a gallery that can't be real. But I've already signed it. The ink is still wet. The ink dried years ago. Both. Neither. All. Welcome to Blackwood Mine. Please sign in for your shift. You already have. Story 6. The anemometer spins backward against the Arctic wind. and I know something is fundamentally wrong with time itself. I've been maintaining sensors at Kittiwake Station for 3 months now, a remote coastal research outpost 60 miles from the nearest human settlement in Alaska. The job seems straightforward enough. Monitor equipment, record data, ensure the automated weather systems keep transmitting to the mainland. What they didn't mention in the job posting was that the laws of physics apparently bend here like light through water. It started with small inconsistencies. The data logger would show timestamps for readings that hadn't happened yet. Temperature spikes at 14:32 when my watch read 14:28. I blamed it on synchronization errors, faulty atomic clock receivers. Easy explanations for an engineer's mind. But then my jacket appeared on the drying line one morning, the right sleeve stiff with sea ice while the rest remained bone dry. I hadn't worn it outside in days. The salt crystals on the cuff tasted real enough when I touched them to my tongue. Bitter and metallic, like frozen time itself. The station consists of 3 prefab buildings connected by enclosed walkways. The main lab with its banks of monitoring equipment, the dormitory with its 4 empty rooms, I'm the sole winter caretaker, and the storage facility that doubles as a workshop. Everything painted that institutional gray-green that's supposed to be calming, but instead makes you feel like you're living inside a dying machine. The windows face the Chukchi Sea, where ice formations crack and reform in patterns that sometimes look too deliberate to be natural. The thermal cameras were the next violation of causality. I review the overnight footage each morning, standard protocol to check for polar bears or equipment malfunctions. Last Tuesday, the timestamp read 3:47 when I watched myself exit the dormitory. Nothing unusual there. I sometimes can't sleep and take walks to clear my head. But at 3:52, the cameras showed me exiting again. Same door, same heavy gate, same way I always bunch my shoulders against the cold. 2 of me, 5 minutes apart, walking into the Arctic night. I checked the hallway. No signs of tampering with the cameras. The digital signatures on the files showed no evidence of editing. According to the thermal imaging system, I had simply existed twice. The rational part of my brain, the part that earned 2 engineering degrees and troubleshot satellite systems for a decade, scrambled for explanations. Hallucinations from isolation, carbon monoxide poisoning, some kind of electromagnetic phenomenon affecting the equipment. I ran every diagnostic test I could think of. The CO detectors showed normal levels. The electromagnetic readings were within standard parameters, though the magnetometer did show some unusual fluctuations that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. Then I found the message on the bulletin board in the break room. My handwriting, my green marker. You come back at 4:06, locked before. I don't remember writing it. The marker was still in my pocket, cap secured, ink level exactly where I'd left it. But the words were there, pressed deep into the corkboard like I'd written them with desperate urgency. The smell of the marker ink was fresh, maybe an hour old. That's when I started keeping the journal. Not this one. Another one, handwritten, locked in the desk drawer. Every event, every anomaly, cross-referenced with timestamps from multiple sources. If I was losing my mind, I wanted documentation. If something else was happening, I wanted evidence. The journal revealed patterns I hadn't consciously noticed. The backwards anemometer always preceded a temporal anomaly by exactly 17 minutes. The data logger's future timestamps clustered around specific times: 4:06, 8:19, 11:43. My duplicate appearances on the thermal cameras happened only on nights when the aurora borealis was visible, even though the cameras were indoors and shouldn't have been affected by the magnetic storms. 3 nights ago, I decided to test it. When the anemometer began its reverse spin at 3:49 a.m., I locked myself in the dormitory. Deadbolt, chair against the door, the whole works. I sat on my bed, watching the clock, waiting for 4:06. At 4:05, I heard footsteps in the hallway. My footsteps. I knew the sound of my own gait, the particular squeak my left boot made on the linoleum. The footsteps stopped outside my door. The doorknob turned. Locked. A pause. Then the unmistakable sound of a key in the lock. I had the only key. It was in my hand, cutting crescents into my palm as I gripped it. The deadbolt turned. I wanted to call out. to demand who was there, but my throat had constricted to the width of a pin. The door opened 6 inches before catching on the chair. Through the gap, I saw a hand. My hand, down to the scar on the knuckle from a childhood accident. It reached through, feeling for the chair, and I noticed the sleeve was soaked, dripping with seawater that hadn't yet frozen. The hand withdrew. The footsteps retreated. At exactly 4:06, they stopped. The next morning, I found wet footprints in the hallway, leading from my door to the external exit. The prints matched my boots perfectly. The door to the outside was locked from the inside, the key hanging in its usual place. But the lock mechanism was corroded with salt, as if it had been submerged in the ocean for years. I've started to notice other things, subtle wrongness in the fabric of causality around the station, echoes that precede their sounds, shadows that fall toward light sources instead of away. The taste of next Tuesday's coffee lingering on my tongue while I drink today's. The sensation of drowning that wakes me at exactly 4:06 every morning, lungs burning with ice water I've never inhaled. The worst part is the writing. I find notes everywhere now, all in my handwriting. Warnings mostly. Don't go outside during the reverse spin. The frequency is increasing. You've already drowned once. That last one was carved into the frost on the mess hall window, backward, as if written from outside. But the security footage shows no one there. Just the words appearing letter by letter, drawn by an invisible finger in the ice. Yesterday I tried to call for evacuation. The satellite phone connected, but the voice on the other end was mine. Not similar to mine, exactly mine, down to the slight lisp I develop when I'm nervous. The other me said I couldn't leave yet, said I had to wait until the cycle completed. When I asked what cycle, the line went dead. The phone's memory showed no record of the call, but the battery was drained as if we'd talked for hours. I've begun to map the anomalies, plotting them on a timeline that increasingly feels like a Mobius strip. Events that haven't happened yet leave evidence. Events that have happened erase themselves. I exist in multiple states simultaneously. The me writing this, the me on the thermal cameras, the wet me trying to enter my room at 4:06, the me leaving messages I don't remember writing. The station's original logs, which I found while searching for explanations, mention nothing unusual, except for one entry from 1987, the year the station was established. A single line in the margin of a weather report. The technician returns at 4:06. He always has. I've checked the employment records. No one named in that report matches my name, but the employee ID number is mine. The number I was assigned 3 months ago. Or was it 3 months? The calendar says February, but my contract was for winter maintenance starting in September. 5 months, but my supplies indicate I've been here for exactly 3 weeks. All these timelines feel equally true, equally false, existing simultaneously in the same space like overlapping radio frequencies. The human mind isn't equipped to process temporal paradoxes. We experience time linearly, cause before effect, past flowing into present into future. But here, at Kittiwake Station, time moves like the tide, in and out, overlapping, leaving things behind and taking things away. I'm starting to understand that I'm not experiencing a breakdown of reality. I'm experiencing reality as it actually is, stripped of the comfortable illusion of linear time. Last night I found myself outside without remembering leaving the building. I was standing at the tide line, my right arm submerged up to the elbow in the freezing water. The aurora borealis painted the sky in shades of green that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. As I pulled my arm from the water, I noticed I was wearing my jacket. The right sleeve was already forming ice crystals. I looked back at the station and saw myself through the mess hall window, sitting at the table writing in this journal. I watched myself look up, stare directly at where I stood on the beach, and write something. When I got back inside, I don't remember the walk, just the transition from beach to building. I read what I'd written. You're standing on the beach right now. The paradox should have shattered something. My mind, reality, the universe itself. Instead, it felt like coming home. like remembering something I'd always known but kept forgetting. The anemometer is spinning backward again. It's 3:49 a.m. In 17 minutes, I'll try to enter my room. I know because I remember it happening, even though it hasn't yet. I remember the frustration of finding the door locked, the cold weight of the key that materialized in my pocket, the urgent need to get inside before what? That's the part I can't quite grasp. The memory slips away like water through fingers every time I reach for it. I've decided to stop fighting it. Tonight, when I hear my footsteps in the hallway, I won't barricade the door. I'll let myself in. Maybe I'll finally understand what I'm trying to tell myself. Maybe I'll remember what happens at 4:07. The strangest thing, or perhaps the most natural thing, in this place where causality is more suggestion than law, is that I'm not afraid anymore. Fear requires uncertainty, and I'm becoming certain that whatever is happening has already happened, is happening now, will happen forever. I exist in all states simultaneously, the researcher documenting anomalies, the anomaly being documented, the documentation itself. The thermal cameras show 5 of me now, all leaving the dormitory at different times that somehow occupy the same moment. The data logger has started recording my pulse rate for next Thursday. My journal contains entries I'll write tomorrow, describing things that happened yesterday which won't occur until next week. I am unstuck in time, but not lost. I'm precisely where I've always been, where I'll always be. Kittiwake Station isn't experiencing a malfunction. It's functioning exactly as designed. And I'm not its caretaker, I'm its component. A gear in a machine that processes time the way other machines process data. The backward anemometer isn't broken. It's measuring the wind that blows from tomorrow into yesterday. The ice on my sleeve isn't from the ocean outside. It's from the ocean I'll fall into, have fallen into, am falling into right now. The me at the door isn't trying to get in. He's trying to warn me not to go out. But I always go out. I have to. It's already happened. The clock reads 4:05. I can hear my footsteps in the hallway. This time I know what I'm coming to say. I know why the lock will be on the wrong side of the door. I know why the key will be in my pocket even though I'm holding it in my hand. Time isn't a river here. It's a whirlpool, and I'm both the water spinning down and the center that never moves. 4:06. The door opens. I see myself standing there, dripping with tomorrow's seawater, eyes wide with yesterday's recognition. We both speak at the same time, the same words. You've already figured it out. And I have. Or I will. Or I am, right now, in this moment that exists in all moments. In this station where time breaks against the shore like waves, leaving fragments of future and past scattered on the beach of an endless present. The anemometer spins backward, forward, stops, spins again. The data logger records everything, nothing, the spaces between. I exist in multiplicity, singularity, the quantum state of being and not being. Kittiwake Station keeps perfect time. It's the rest of the world that's running slow. Story 7. The wind never stops in West Texas. It's a constant companion, a white noise that seeps into your bones until you forget what silence sounds like. I've been maintaining turbines out here for 7 years, and I thought I'd gotten used to it all. The isolation, the endless horizon, the mechanical groans of the giants spinning against the sky. But Turbine 47 changed everything. It started 3 weeks ago. I was running my usual maintenance route through Section C of the wind farm, checking blade pitch angles and generator temperatures. The sun was already brutal at 9 in the morning, turning the metal towers into vertical ovens. Turbine 47 stood at the edge of the array, slightly separated from its siblings like it had been shunned. I'd always found that odd. The spacing was deliberate according to the blueprints, but it felt wrong somehow, like looking at a smile with one tooth knocked askew. The first thing I noticed was the sound. Every turbine has its own voice, a combination of blade whoosh, generator hum, and structural creaks that becomes as familiar as a signature. But 47 had developed something new. a low, rhythmic groan that pulsed beneath its normal operating noise. I pulled out my phone to record it for the maintenance log, standard procedure for unusual sounds. When I played it back in my truck later, the hair on my arm stood up. Through the speaker, barely audible but undeniably there, I heard words. Alter the order. Just those 3 words, repeated in the gaps between the mechanical sounds. I played it again, and again. Each time, the words became clearer, like my ears were learning to translate some primitive language hidden in the machinery. I should have reported it immediately, should have tagged the turbine for inspection and moved on. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was pride, maybe curiosity, or maybe it was already too late by then. Instead, I decided to climb. The ladder on turbine 47 runs up the inside of the tower, a narrow metal spine with safety rails on either side. I'd climbed it dozens of times before. The maintenance manual says it's 287 rungs from bottom platform to nacelle access. I've never bothered counting. Muscle memory takes over after the first few climbs, and your body knows when you're getting close to the top. But that day, something felt off. My rhythm was broken. I kept reaching for rungs that weren't where I expected them to be. My boots searching for purchase on steps that seemed to have shifted. About halfway up, I stopped to catch my breath and looked down. The ground seemed farther away than it should have been. I started counting the rungs as I climbed. By the time I reached the nacelle, I'd counted 293. 6 extra rungs. I chalked it up to exhaustion, the heat making me see things. The desert does that to you sometimes. Makes you question your senses. I completed my inspection, everything reading normal except for that persistent groan, and descended. On the way down, I counted again. 294 rungs. That night, I pulled out the turbine schematics from my garage. The technical drawings were clear. 287 rungs, spaced at exactly 16 inches. I'd looked at these blueprints 100 times. There was no ambiguity, no revision notes. 287. The next morning I went back. I needed to understand what was happening, needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. The wind was stronger that day, gusting hard enough to make the turbine blades flex visibly. That groaning sound was louder too, almost conversational in its rhythm. I recorded it again, and this time when I played it back, the message had changed. Count the ascending order. I began to climb, marking each rung with a chalk tick as I went. 1, 2, 3. The metal was cold despite the morning heat, and my hands left brief fog prints that evaporated instantly. 20, 21, 22. The ladder seemed to stretch above me, an endless vertical tunnel. 50, 51, 52. At rung 100, I found something that shouldn't have been there. Tucked into a junction between the ladder and the tower wall was a canvas tool bag, the kind we'd stopped using 5 years ago when the company switched to synthetic materials. My name was embroidered on the side, not printed or written, but carefully stitched in a style I recognized. My grandmother had taught me that same cross-stitch pattern when I was young. But the bag was ancient, the canvas rotted through in places, metal fixtures consumed by rust that should have taken decades to form. Inside the bag was a single tool, a hexagonal key unlike any in my current kit. It was pristine, untouched by the decay that had claimed the bag. The metal was warm to the touch, almost pulse-like, and it fit perfectly in my hand like it had been molded for my grip. I continued climbing, the tool in my pocket now, its weight somehow both reassuring and deeply wrong. At rung 200, the groaning stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Not just the absence of that strange sound, but a complete void where the wind itself seemed to pause. In that moment, I heard my own heartbeat, for the first time in years, rabbit quick and frightened. When I finally reached the nacelle after counting 301 rungs, I found a panel I'd never noticed before. It was seamlessly integrated into the housing, visible only because a thin line of dust had settled into its edges. There were no visible bolts, no access screws, nothing that should have allowed it to open. But I knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that the key in my pocket would fit. The hexagonal key slid into an opening that materialized as I approached, like the metal was responding to proximity. The panel swung inward silently, revealing a small compartment that couldn't exist according to any schematic I'd ever seen. Inside was a photograph, protected by clear plastic that had yellowed with age. The photo showed the wind farm, taken from exactly where I stood in the nacelle. All 48 turbines were visible, their shadows creating a precise geometric pattern across the desert floor. But in the image, my truck, unmistakably my truck with its cracked windshield and mismatched driver's door, was parked at the base of Turbine 13. I never park there. The access road doesn't even reach that turbine. You have to walk a quarter-mile through rough terrain to reach it. I looked out the nacelle window toward Turbine 13. My truck was there, exactly as shown in the photograph. Despite the fact that I'd parked at 47's base not 30 minutes ago, I could see it clearly. The cracked windshield catching the sun, the faded blue paint of that replacement door I'd installed after backing into a gate post last winter. The climb down was wrong in ways I can't fully articulate. The rungs felt soft under my boots, yielding slightly like they were made of something other than steel. My chalk marks were gone, but in their place were other marks, older, made by someone else's hand in what looked like white paint that had mostly flaked away. The count was different again. 289 rungs this time, just 2 more than the blueprints claimed. My truck was at the base of 47 when I emerged, right where I'd left it, keys in my pocket where they belonged. But when I opened the door, there was dust on the seat. Weeks of it, undisturbed. The odometer showed an extra 127 miles I hadn't driven. I drove to Turbine 13, my hands shaking on the wheel. The desert between the access roads was rough but navigable if you knew the path. I didn't know the path, had never driven it before, but my hands seemed to, turning the wheel at just the right moments to avoid the worst of the rocks and ruts. When I reached 13, I found tire tracks in the hard-packed earth. My tire tracks, with that distinctive wear pattern from my misaligned front left wheel. They looked weeks old. That was when I started checking the recordings more carefully. Every time I captured that groaning sound, the message evolved. Alter the ascending order. Count the ascending order. You've altered the order. You're ascending out of order. Each playback revealed new words, new implications, like the sound was a living thing that grew more complex with observation. I've been back to Turbine 47 every day since. The ladder count is never the same twice. 288, 295, 283, 302. The tool bag is sometimes there, sometimes not, but always in different stages of decay when it appears. Once, I found it pristine and new with a receipt inside dated 3 years in the future. The photograph changes too. Sometimes my truck is at different turbines. Sometimes there are 2 of my trucks. Once, I saw myself in the photo, climbing a turbine that doesn't exist, wearing clothes I don't own. Yesterday's recording was the clearest yet. The words came through without any filtering, as clear as if someone was standing beside me. The order has always been altered. You're not ascending, you're remembering. I've started finding my tools in impossible places. Wrenches inside sealed gearboxes, my multimeter buried in concrete that's been solid since the foundation was poured. My maintenance logs show entries I don't remember making, repairs to problems that haven't happened yet, or maybe happened long ago. The company database has records of my employment dating back 15 years. I've only worked here for 7. This morning, I found another photograph in the panel, which now opens without the key. It shows the wind farm from above, all 48 turbines spinning in perfect synchronization except for one, Turbine 47, which stands still while a figure climbs its ladder. The figure is frozen between rungs, caught in an eternal ascent or descent, impossible to tell which. When I enhance the image on my phone, zooming in until the pixels blur, I can just make out the figure's face. It's me, of course, but I'm older in the photo, or younger. The image shifts when I'm not looking directly at it. Sometimes I'm climbing up, sometimes down. Sometimes I'm just hanging there, suspended between rungs that shouldn't exist on a ladder that can't decide how many steps it needs. The other maintenance techs have started avoiding me. They say I've been acting strange, that I've been talking to myself near Turbine 47, that they've seen me there at impossible hours, midnight, 3 a.m., times when the site is supposed to be empty. But I check my logs, and I was home those nights. I have receipts from the gas station, time-stamped photos on my phone. I was elsewhere. I've always been elsewhere. Except I found my flashlight at the base of 47 yesterday, dead batteries and all, though I know I left it in my truck. And there was mud on my boots from the rain 2 nights ago, the night I supposedly spent watching TV 50 miles away. The mud had a boot print in it, someone else's boot, standing where I would have stood to look up at the turbine. Size 11, same as mine, same wear pattern on the heel. Today I climbed again. I had to. The compulsion is stronger than fear now, stronger than logic. The count was 287, exactly what the blueprints say, for the first time since this all started. But when I reached the nacelle, everything was different. The panel was gone, sealed over like it had never existed. The familiar groaning sound had stopped. The turbine ran smooth and quiet, textbook perfect. But there was a new tool bag at the top, synthetic material with my name printed on a label that looked fresh from the factory. Inside was my current multimeter, the one I thought was in my truck, and a note in my handwriting. Check turbine 13. The count is wrong. I'm sitting in my truck now, parked at the base of 47, trying to decide if I should drive to 13 or just go home. The wind has picked up, and all the turbines are spinning except 47, which has stopped despite showing normal operation on my diagnostic tablet. In the distance, I can see someone climbing turbine 13. They're wearing my company coveralls, using my deliberate, methodical climbing style. My phone is recording the sound of turbine 47's silence. When I play it back, I know there will be words hidden in the absence of noise, instructions or warnings, or maybe just observations about what's happening to me, or what's already happened, or what will always be happening. The photograph from the panel is on my dashboard, shifting every time a cloud passes over the sun. Sometimes it shows the wind farm as it is, sometimes as it was, sometimes as it might be. In all versions, there's a figure climbing, always climbing, never reaching the top or bottom, caught between rungs that multiply and divide according to rules I'm beginning to think I wrote myself, in a past or future I can't quite remember or forget. I'm going to check turbine 13 now. I have to know if the person climbing is me, or was me, or will be me. The count is wrong there too, I'm certain of it. Certain in the way you know something in a dream, with conviction that evaporates in daylight but feels absolute in the moment. The wind is howling now, but turbine 47 stays silent, its blades locked in place like it's waiting. The groaning will start again soon. It always does, carrying messages I'm not sure I'm meant to decode, or that I've already decoded, or that I'm in the process of encoding myself. I check my phone one more time before driving to 13. There's a video I don't remember taking, shot from the top of a turbine showing someone examining a tool bag far below. The timestamp is 3 weeks from now. When I zoom in on the figure's face looking up at the camera, it's me, of course, but younger or older, ascending or descending, always caught between numbers that won't stay counted. The order has been altered, or needs to be altered, or was always altered. I'm ascending now, driving toward turbine 13 where I'm already climbing, where I've always been climbing, where the rungs are waiting to be counted wrong in just the right way. The wind never stops in West Texas, except when it does, except when it must, except when someone needs to hear the words hidden in the silence between the counts. I'll know what the message means when I reach the top, or the bottom, or the middle that keeps moving, one rung at a time, in an order that someone, maybe me, has already altered. Story 8. The fog bells started ringing the moment I signed the lease. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The sky so clear you could see the islands scattered across Casco Bay like dropped coins. The real estate agent's pen scratched across the paper, and somewhere beyond the window, those brass bells began their hollow song. She glanced up, confused, checking her phone for weather updates that would explain fog warnings on such a crystalline day. I should have walked away then, should have torn up the lease, apologized for wasting her time, and driven back to Boston. But the house had already begun its work on me. The way the floorboards creaked in perfect rhythm with my heartbeat. How the salt-stained windows filtered the light into patterns that seemed almost like writing, messages I couldn't quite read. The house sat perched on the eastern edge of Portland's coast, a weathered Victorian that had survived more nor'easters than anyone cared to count. Its nearest neighbor was the Portland Head Light, that famous lighthouse painted on postcards and coffee mugs, its tower visible from my bedroom window. The previous tenant had left suddenly, the agent mentioned offhandedly. Something about a job opportunity overseas. She'd left behind furniture, dishes, even clothes in the closets, all included in the surprisingly reasonable rent. My first night, I made plans to explore the old port, wrote them down in my journal, dinner at 4th Street, drinks at Hunt and Alpine Club, maybe catch some live music. The moment my pen lifted from the page, the fog bells rang out across the harbor. The sound rolled through the walls, vibrating in my chest. I checked the weather. Clear skies, light wind from the west. Yet those bells continued their warning for exactly 13 strikes before falling silent. I stayed in that night, told myself I was tired from the move. The back door changed on the 3rd day. I'd gone out that morning through the kitchen exit, heading down to the rocky shore to watch the sunrise paint the lighthouse gold. When I returned, coffee-deprived and shivering in the October cold, a second deadbolt had appeared above the original lock. The brass was tarnished green with age, as if it had been there for decades. But more unsettling was the scratch beside it in the white paint, a looping mark that looked exactly like my signature, the distinctive way I curved the M in my last name. I ran my finger over the scratch. The paint flaked away, revealing more scratches underneath, layer upon layer of the same signature going back through countless coats of paint. My signature, repeated like a record skipping through time. The locksmith I called couldn't see the second lock. He stood at my back door, tool bag in hand, looking at me with the kind of careful concern reserved for people having public breakdowns. He saw only the original deadbolt, he insisted, checking his work order twice. I paid him for his time and watched him leave, his truck disappearing around the bend where the road curved away from the coast. The lock was still there when I looked again. I could touch it, turn it, feel the mechanism click. I found a key for it that evening, sitting in the drawer where I kept my spare keys. It had always been there. My fingers recognized its weight, though I had no memory of placing it among my things. That night, I made plans again. Tomorrow, drive to Boston, pack remaining boxes, close out storage unit. The fog bells rang before the ink dried. 13 strikes, always 13, counting them off like a clock that only marked the hours I intended to leave. The mirror in the hallway began its tricks the following week. It was an antique, the glass slightly warped with age, surrounded by a frame of carved driftwood. Each morning, my reflection wore something different. A watch I didn't own, glasses I'd thrown away years ago, a wedding ring I'd never worn. But it was the mechanical pencil that made my hands shake. I'd lost it 3 weeks before moving to Portland, somewhere between my office and the subway station. It had been my father's, silver, with his initials engraved on the clip. In the mirror, it peeked out from my shirt pocket, exactly where he used to keep it. When I looked down at my actual chest, nothing. But when I looked up again, there it was in the reflection, and I could swear I felt its weight against my ribs. That afternoon, I found it on my dresser. The metal was cold, beaded with moisture that tasted of salt when I accidentally touched my finger to my lips. The pencil was real, solid, exactly as I remembered down to the tiny dent where I'd dropped it years ago. Yet it couldn't be here. I'd searched everywhere for it, turned my Boston apartment inside out. I started testing the mirror. Each day my reflection would have something I'd lost. A tie clip, a fountain pen, a leather journal, a pocket knife. And each day, I would find that exact item somewhere in the house, always damp with sea spray, always exactly where the mirror suggested it should be. The house was returning things to me, pulling them from somewhere, someone else. The lighthouse became my metronome of madness. At first, I thought I was imagining the synchronization, The human brain loves patterns, finds faces in clouds and meaning in coincidence. But I began timing it, counting the seconds between flashes. When I stood at the kitchen window, the light pulsed every 4 seconds, the exact rhythm of my relaxed breathing. When I exercised, jumping jacks in the living room, the lighthouse accelerated to match my elevated respiratory rate. Even at night, waking from dreams I couldn't remember, I'd see that beam sweeping across my ceiling in perfect time with my lungs. I tried holding my breath. The lighthouse went dark. For 30 seconds, 40, 50, as long as I could manage without air, the lighthouse stayed black. The moment I gasped, the light blazed back to life, and I heard something like laughter carried on the wind. Or maybe it was just the fog bells, ringing their warning into the clear night air. The previous tenant had left journals. I found them in the attic, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind a loose board. Her handwriting was cramped, urgent, filling page after page with observations that mirrored my own. The second lock, the mirror, the lighthouse breathing. But she'd gone further, stayed longer, understood more. "The house remembers," she wrote. "Every tenant leaves an impression, like a hand pressed into wet clay. We're all still here, layered on top of each other like coats of paint. When I look in the mirror, I see myself, but I also see her, the woman before me, and behind her, another and another, stretching back like nested dolls. We all signed the same lease. We all made plans to leave. We all heard the bells." I flipped to her final entry, dated 3 months before I'd moved in. "I understand now. The house doesn't trap us. We trap ourselves. Every time we make plans to leave, we're already planning to return." I've seen myself in the mirror, older, grayer, still standing in this hallway. The lighthouse doesn't follow our breathing. We're breathing with it. We always have been. That night, I decided to leave everything behind. No plans, no notes, no preparation. I would simply walk out the door and drive away. But as I reached for my keys, I noticed the scratches on the kitchen table, dozens of tally marks grouped in sets of 13. My handwriting was underneath, days since last attempt. I didn't remember making those marks. The mirror showed me something new the next morning. Not an object this time, but myself, standing in the hallway, looking into the mirror. And in that reflection's reflection, another me, looking back. The recursion continued, smaller and smaller, each version of me slightly different, older, younger, wearing clothes from different decades. All of us stood in the same spot, looking at the same mirror, trapped in the same moment of realization. I raised my hand. They all raised theirs, but not in unison. The gesture rippled through the reflections like a wave, each one moving a fraction of a second after the last, or before. Time didn't seem to flow properly in that silver surface. The fog bells rang, though I hadn't written any plans. 13 strikes, as always, but this time they seemed to come from inside the house. I followed the sound to the basement, where I found a bell hung from the ceiling, its rope extending up through a hole cut in the floor above. The rope was moving, pulled by invisible hands, though I was alone in the house. Or I thought I was alone. The locksmith's business card was still on my kitchen counter, but when I called, the number was disconnected. I looked up his company online. It had closed in 1987. The real estate agent's office had no record of my lease, no record of her employee by that name. The previous tenant's journals were dated in my handwriting, though I couldn't remember writing them. I've stopped trying to leave, not because I can't. I could walk out right now if I wanted, but I've begun to suspect that I already have. That I'm already in Boston or Portland or somewhere else entirely, living a different life where I never signed this lease. And somewhere, in that life, I'm having dreams about a house by a lighthouse, dreams that feel so real I could swear I'm living them. The lighthouse flashes as I write this, keeping time with my breath. In the mirror, I see myself writing, but the words on the page are different. The me in the reflection is writing about a house in Salem, or Gloucester, or Bar Harbor. Different houses, same story, all of us writing at the same time. Our mechanical pencils, father's pencil, scratching against paper that smells of salt and age. Sometimes I wonder if the house is protecting us or collecting us. If the second lock is keeping something out or keeping something in. If the objects appearing are gifts or bait, breadcrumbs leading deeper into a forest we've already lost ourselves in. The fog bells are ringing again. 13 strikes. Always 13. I check my journal, looking for plans I don't remember making. Today's entry, in my handwriting: visit the lighthouse. Ask about the bells. I know I shouldn't go. Every instinct screams against it. But I also know that I've already gone, am going, will go. In the mirror, I'm already walking up the lighthouse steps. On my dresser, wet with sea spray, sits a key I've never seen before. It's brass, tarnished green with age, and I know without trying that it will fit the lighthouse door. The house remembers everything. Every tenant, every attempt to leave, every moment of realization. We're all still here, layered like paint, breathing with the lighthouse beam, and somewhere, in another reflection, another version of me is writing this story, changing the details, trying to warn someone who might be me, or might be you, or might be no one at all. I've been here 3 weeks, or 3 months, or 3 years. The calendar on the wall shows dates that haven't happened yet, appointments I don't remember making. The previous tenants' clothes fit perfectly. They've always fit perfectly. They've always been my clothes. The lighthouse is calling. It's been calling since before I arrived. Will keep calling after I leave. If leaving is something that can still happen in a place where time folds in on itself like recurring waves against the shore. I know what I'll find when I reach the lighthouse. Another door with another lock, another scratch that looks like my signature. Inside, a room full of mirrors, each one showing a different version of this moment. And in the center, a fog bell, waiting for someone to ring it 13 times. I'm going now. I've always been going. In the mirror, I'm already there, already ringing the bell, already understanding what the house has been trying to tell me. We don't haunt this place. We are this place. We always have been. The key is cold in my hand, wet with spray from a sea I can't quite reach. Outside, the fog bells ring their warning into the clear October sky, and the lighthouse breathes with me, with all of us, forever and never, in perfect, terrible time. Story 9. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I blamed it on exhaustion. 3 months had passed since the divorce, and I'd been sleeping poorly, haunted by the echo of empty rooms in my new studio apartment. The storage unit on Kedzie Avenue held everything I couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't bring myself to throw away. Furniture from our old place in Lincoln Park, boxes of photographs, winter clothes that still smelled faintly of her perfume. I'd gone there on a humid Tuesday morning in August, the kind of day when the Chicago heat presses down like a physical weight. The industrial corridor was deserted, except for the distant hum of the Kennedy Expressway. My unit, B47, sat at the end of a long hallway lined with identical orange doors, each secured with a heavy padlock. When I lifted the corrugated metal door, the familiar musty smell hit me first. Cardboard and dust and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. It took my eyes a moment to adjust to the dim light filtering in from the hallway. That's when I saw it. The boxes had been rearranged. Not drastically, not obviously, but with the subtle precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The stack of bankers' boxes that had been against the left wall now formed an L shape, creating a narrow corridor that led deeper into the unit. My old leather armchair, which I distinctly remembered shoving into the back corner, now faced the entrance at a slight angle, positioned exactly where it used to sit in our living room, angled toward where the television would have been. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos I'd taken when I first rented the unit. There, proof that I wasn't imagining things. The boxes had definitely been moved. Someone had been in here. I checked the padlock, running my thumb over the familiar scratches on its surface. It was mine, the same master lock I'd bought at the hardware store down the street. But when I turned it over, the serial number made my blood run cold. 5-7739-J2. I knew that number. I'd photographed it years ago for our home inventory after we'd been burglarized. This was the padlock from our old apartment, the one I'd thrown away after the break-in. The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe I'd grabbed the wrong lock by mistake. Maybe I'd never actually thrown it away. But deep down, in that primitive part of the mind that still believes in monsters under the bed, I knew something was profoundly wrong. I spent the next hour meticulously documenting everything with my phone, creating a visual inventory of every box, every piece of furniture, every shadow. The August heat had turned the storage unit into an oven, and sweat ran down my spine as I worked. Several times I had the distinct sensation of being watched, that prickling awareness that makes you turn around even when you know you're alone. Each time I spun around, there was nothing but the empty hallway stretching toward the exit. As I was leaving, I ran my finger along a dusty shelf near the door. The dust was thick, undisturbed, except for a single track that curved toward the center of the unit. A track with regular indentations, like wheels. Like the wheels on the old office chair I'd left at the apartment when we moved out. The chair I'd watched the new tenants throw away. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the storage unit. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of my cramped studio, replaying every detail. The precision of the rearrangement haunted me. It wasn't random or chaotic like a break-in would be. It was deliberate, purposeful, as if someone was trying to recreate something from memory. I returned the next morning, earlier this time, when the fog still clung to Lake Michigan, and the city was just beginning to wake. The hallway lights flickered as I approached B47, casting dancing shadows that made the orange doors seem to pulse and breathe. My hand shook as I fumbled with the lock. Everything had moved again. This time, the changes were more pronounced. The armchair had been pulled forward another 3 feet, and a cardboard box had been placed beside it like an end table. On top of the box sat my old coffee mug, the one with the chip on the handle, positioned exactly where I used to set it every morning while reading the news on my laptop. The mug was clean, free of dust, as if someone had recently washed it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the imprint in the seat cushion of the armchair. Fresh, deep, still holding the warmth of recent occupation despite the cool morning air. Someone had been sitting there. Recently, perhaps minutes ago. I backed out of the unit, my heart hammering against my ribs. The hallway stretched impossibly long in both directions, every shadow a potential hiding place. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and too loud in the silence. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A security camera mounted in the corner where the hallway met the main corridor. Relief flooded through me. There would be footage, proof. The facility manager, a heavy-set man named Derek who always smelled of cigarettes and cheap cologne, was surprisingly helpful when I explained my concern about a possible break-in. He led me to a cramped office behind the main desk and pulled up the security footage on an ancient desktop computer. We scrolled through hours of grainy black and white video. The timestamp showed 4:44 a.m. when something finally appeared on screen. A figure walking down the hallway toward B47. The image was poor quality, pixelated and stuttering, but I could make out basic details. Average height, wearing a dark jacket, moving with a familiar gait that made my stomach clench. The figure stopped at my unit, produced a key, and opened the padlock with practiced ease. No hesitation, no fumbling. They knew exactly what they were doing. As they raised the door and stepped inside, the figure turned slightly toward the camera. It was me, or rather, it looked exactly like me, down to the way I favored my left shoulder from an old injury. But the jacket, I recognized that jacket. It was my old Columbia windbreaker, the one I'd donated to Goodwill months ago. The one I'd worn in a photo from our last anniversary dinner. A photo that was now packed somewhere in those boxes. My throat constricted. Derek was looking at me strangely, his expression shifting from confusion to suspicion. "That's not me," I heard myself say, but the words sounded hollow, unconvincing even to my own ears. Derek replayed the footage. There I was, or wasn't, entering my own storage unit at 4:44 a.m. The timestamp burned into my retinas. I'd been asleep at that time, alone in my apartment, hadn't I? I left the facility in a daze, my mind reeling. The rational explanation was obvious. I was having some kind of breakdown. Stress-induced sleepwalking, perhaps. Dissociative episodes brought on by the divorce, but that didn't explain the padlock, or how I could have gotten to the storage facility and back without my car, or why I would have that jacket. That evening, I installed a motion sensor in the storage unit, one of those smart home devices that sends alerts to your phone. I also set up my old laptop with its webcam facing the door, programmed to record any movement. If I, came back, I would know. The alert came at exactly 4:44 a.m. I jolted awake, my phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. The notification showed motion detected in the storage unit. My heart racing, I opened the webcam feed. The image was dark, grainy, but I could see the storage unit door was open. A figure moved in the shadows, arranging boxes with mechanical precision. Then it stepped into the dim light from the hallway. It was me again. But this time, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. The figure was wearing the same t-shirt and sweatpants I had on at that very moment. As I watched, frozen in horror, the figure on the screen moved to the armchair and sat down. It picked up the coffee mug, raised it to its lips in a pantomime of drinking, then set it down in exactly the same spot. Then it looked directly at the camera. The face was mine, but wrong. The features were all there. My nose, my eyes, my mouth. But they seemed to shift and blur at the edges, as if I was looking at a reflection in disturbed water. The thing that wore my face smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that I had never made in my life. I was out of bed and dressed in seconds, my hands shaking as I grabbed my car keys. The drive to the storage facility was a blur of red lights ignored and speed limits broken. The city was dead at this hour, the streets empty except for the occasional taxi or delivery truck. The closer I got to Kedzie Avenue, the more the world seemed to warp around the edges, reality becoming thin and fragile like old paper. The facility was silent when I arrived. The electronic lock buzzed me in with my access code. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallways as I ran toward B47. My phone held out in front of me, still streaming the webcam feed. On the screen, the figure continued to sit in the armchair, unmoving, waiting. I rounded the corner. The storage unit door was closed, the padlock secured. With trembling fingers, I opened it and raised the door. The unit was empty. Not just empty of intruders, but completely, impossibly empty. No boxes, no furniture, no dust. Just bare concrete walls and the lingering smell of industrial cleaner. Even the webcam I'd set up was gone. I stood there staring at the empty space, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Then I looked at my phone. The webcam feed was still running, still showing the storage unit. But in the feed, the unit was full. The boxes were there, the armchair was there, and sitting in the armchair was the thing that looked like me. It stood up slowly, deliberately, and walked toward the camera. Its face filled the screen, and this time I could see its eyes clearly. They were my eyes, but behind them was something else. Something that had been watching me from every reflection, every photograph, every memory stored in those boxes. It raised one hand and pointed at something off-screen. The camera angle shifted, impossible since the laptop should have been stationary, and showed another figure standing in the doorway of the storage unit. This figure was shrouded in shadow, but I could see it was holding something, a padlock. The old padlock from our apartment. The feed cut out. I stood in the empty storage unit for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When I finally left, I noticed something I'd missed before. On the concrete floor, barely visible in the harsh fluorescent light, was a faint outline in the dust. The outline of boxes, furniture, a life I'd tried to pack away. And in the center, the clear impression of footprints leading from the door to where the armchair would have been. They were my footprints. I recognized the worn pattern of my sneakers, but there was only one set, leading into the unit. None leading out. I drove home as the sun rose over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that looked too vivid, too real. My studio apartment felt different when I returned, though nothing had visibly changed. The angles seemed wrong. The shadows fell in unfamiliar patterns. I sat on my bed trying to make sense of what had happened when I noticed something that made my heart stop. On my nightstand next to my phone sat the coffee mug from the storage unit, the one with the chipped handle. It was full of coffee, still steaming, prepared exactly the way I liked it. 2 sugars, no cream. I hadn't made coffee. I hadn't even been home. I picked up my phone to call someone, anyone, but stopped when I saw the photos. Hundreds of them, all taken in the last few hours while I'd been at the storage facility. Photos of me sleeping in my bed. Photos of me driving to Kedzie Avenue. Photos of me standing in the empty storage unit. All taken from angles that should have been impossible, from perspectives that didn't exist. In the last photo, I saw myself sitting on my bed, holding my phone, looking at photos. The image was taken from directly behind me, but when I turned around, there was only the blank wall of my studio apartment. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, the incidents have escalated. I find myself in places with no memory of how I got there. I'll check my phone and discover hours of missing time, filled with pictures of me doing things I don't remember, shopping for furniture I didn't buy, having conversations with people who swear they've never seen me, standing in front of the old apartment in Lincoln Park at 4:44 a.m. The storage unit doesn't exist anymore. I went back yesterday and Derek claimed they'd never had a unit B47. The security footage from that night shows empty hallways. My bank statements show no payments to a storage facility. But I still have the key on my keyring, still have the photos on my phone, still have the coffee mug that appears on my nightstand every morning at 4:44. Last night I stayed awake, determined to catch whatever was happening. At 4:43, I was wide awake, sitting in my kitchen with every light on. At 4:44, I blinked. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in a storage unit. Not B47, but another one, identical in every way except for the number on the door, B48. The unit was full of my things, arranged exactly as they'd been in the old apartment, and sitting in the armchair, looking at me with eyes that were mine but not mine, was myself. It spoke with my voice, but the words came from somewhere else, somewhere that existed in the spaces between the boxes, in the dust that accumulated in places no one looked, in the photographs that captured moments just before or just after they actually happened. "You've been trying so hard to pack it all away," it said, gesturing at the boxes. "But some things can't be stored. Some things follow you no matter how many times you change the locks." I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my throat was full of dust. "Every time you visit," it continued, "you rearrange things a little, trying to make sense of it all, trying to put the pieces back together. But you can't reassemble a life from boxes of memories. You can't recreate what was lost by moving furniture around in the dark." The thing that wore my face stood up and walked toward me. With each step, it became more solid, more real, while I felt myself becoming translucent, fading like an old photograph left in the sun. "The question," it said, stopping inches from my face, "is not whether I'm real or you're having a breakdown. The question is, which one of us has been living your life for the last 3 months? Which one of us is standing in a storage unit at 4:44 a.m., and which one is asleep in bed dreaming of being awake?" I blinked. I was in my bed, gasping for air, soaked in sweat. My phone showed 4:45 a.m. On the nightstand, the coffee mug was full and steaming. Next to it lay a new padlock, still in its packaging, with a serial number I recognized but couldn't quite place. I don't go to storage units anymore. I don't pack things away. I keep everything in my studio apartment now, even though it's cramped, even though there's barely room to move. Because I've learned that the things we try to store away don't disappear. They just find other places to exist, other versions of ourselves to inhabit. Sometimes late at night, I catch glimpses of him, the other me, in reflections and shadows. He's still there, still arranging and rearranging, still trying to rebuild something from the pieces I left behind. And sometimes, in those moments between sleep and waking, I'm not sure which one of us is real, which one is the reflection, and which one is just another thing packed away in a box, waiting to be discovered again at 4:44 a.m. The coffee mug is always full. The padlock always appears. And somewhere in Chicago, in a storage unit that doesn't exist, another version of me sits in an old leather armchair, surrounded by the ghosts of a life I'm not sure I ever really lived. Story 10. The printer jammed again at 2:47 a.m., and when I freed the paper, 3 tickets spilled out with timestamps for 3:15, 3:22, and 3:38. My watch showed 2:47. It had shown 2:47 for the last 6 minutes. I'd been working the night shift at the Bainbridge Island ferry terminal for 8 months, long enough to know the rhythms of the place, the groaning of metal against water, the particular way the wind funneled through the toll booth, creating a low whistle that sounded almost like humming, long enough to recognize the regulars, the nurse heading home from her shift at Virginia Mason, the contractor who always fell asleep in his truck during the crossing, the woman in the silver sedan who never made eye contact. But not long enough to understand why the booth smelled like rain when the concrete floor beneath my feet was bone dry. Not long enough to explain the reflection. I picked up the premature tickets, each one crisp and properly formatted. Vehicle type: sedan. License plate: the first one read KPL 4729. My own car sat in the employee lot, plate number KPL 4279. 1 letter off, 1 number transposed. The second ticket showed JPL 4729. The third, KQL 4729. Variations on a theme I didn't want to explore. The reflection appeared at the end of the boarding ramp as I was processing the tickets into the system. They had to be logged, even the impossible ones. In the puddle that shouldn't exist in November's dry cold, I saw the MV Wenatchee pulling away from the dock, its running lights trailing across the water like luminous scars. When I looked up, the actual ferry sat perfectly still, secured by massive ropes thicker than my arm, its engines silent. I looked back down. The reflection showed open water. My shift supervisor, Dale, had warned me about the overnight hours when he hired me. "The mind plays tricks after midnight," he'd said, tapping ash from his cigarette into a styrofoam cup. "You see things that aren't there, or you stop seeing things that are. Just stick to the routine. Process the tickets, check the manifests, walk the perimeter every 2 hours. Don't overthink it." Dale had worked here for 17 years before moving to Days. He never explained why he requested the transfer. The next car pulled up to my window, headlights cutting through the mist that had begun to gather despite the weather forecast predicting clear skies. The driver handed me a credit card without speaking. I processed the payment, printed the ticket, and as I handed it back through the window, I noticed his hands. The calluses matched mine exactly. Rough patches at the base of each finger where the ticket machine's edge wore against skin, night after night. He had the same small scar on his right thumb that I'd gotten 2 months ago on a broken paper tray. He drove off before I could say anything. I told myself it was the lighting. The yellow sodium lamps turned everyone sallow, made details blur. I'd mistaken similar injuries for identical ones. The human mind seeks patterns, even where none exist. The pen in my pocket felt heavier than usual. At 3:15, a sedan rolled up. Plate number, KPL 4729. I checked the ticket I'd printed half an hour earlier. The timestamps matched. The driver was me, or something wearing my face with subtle incorrectness, like a photograph that had been adjusted just enough to make the subject look slightly ill. His eyes didn't quite focus on mine when I handed him the ticket. "Have a safe crossing," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. He nodded and drove onto the ferry without a word. I stepped out of the booth. The air held that particular weight that comes before a storm, heavy with electricity and potential. But the sky remained stubbornly clear, stars visible between the lights of the city across the sound. The ferry sat motionless at the dock, I counted the cars on board. 43. The manifest showed 42. When I returned to the booth, there was a drawing on the counter. The sketch showed my profile rendered in quick, confident strokes. The line of my jaw, the slope of my nose, the way my hair fell across my forehead. It was executed in blue ink, the exact shade of the pen in my pocket. The same pen I'd been carrying since my second week on the job. A cheap Bic I'd found in the booth's utility drawer and claimed as my own because it wrote smoothly and never seemed to run out of ink. I pulled the pen from my pocket and held it up to the drawing. The ink matched perfectly. The style matched the nervous doodles I'd been making on scratch paper during slow hours. Geometric patterns, stylized eyes, profiles of people I'd never met. But this was my profile, and I had no memory of drawing it. The paper felt damp, as though it had been left out in rain that had never fallen. Over the next hour, 4 more cars arrived with variations of my license plate. Each driver handed me payment, with hands that bore injuries I recognized. Each ticket I printed had been pre-generated by the machine at impossible times. The reflection at the end of the ramp showed the ferry in constant motion, pulling away or pulling in, never still, while the physical vessel remained locked in place by steel and rope, and the simple laws of physics I was beginning to distrust. The booth's phone rang at 4:33 a.m. I let it ring 7 times before answering, counting each electronic trill as it echoed off the concrete and steel around me. "Toll booth 3, I said. Static answered me, punctuated by something that might have been breathing or might have been the white noise of a bad connection. Then, very faintly, my own voice speaking words I hadn't yet said. "I think I'm starting to understand." I hung up quickly enough to bruise my fingers on the handset. The 2-hour perimeter check was due. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into air that now smelled definitively of rain. That petrichor scent of water on hot pavement, except the pavement was cold and had been dry for days. My footsteps echoed wrong, arriving at my ears a fraction of a second too late, as though the sound had to travel an extra distance to reach me. The ferry dock stretched out in a long concrete tongue, licked by dark water. Streetlights cast pools of yellow illumination that didn't quite connect, leaving gaps of shadow where anything might crouch unseen. I walked the route Dale had shown me on my first day, along the vehicle lanes, around the perimeter fence, past the maintenance shed where spare equipment sat in neat rows like sleeping metal animals. Near the fence, I found wet footprints leading away from the water. They matched my shoes perfectly, the distinctive tread pattern of my work boots, size 11, with the small chip missing from the left heel where I'd caught it on a curb 3 weeks ago. The prints led from the sound up to the fence, then stopped. They didn't turn around. They didn't continue. They simply ended, as though whoever made them had stepped through the chain link and into the parking lot beyond without bothering with gates or physics. I pressed my own boot next to one of the prints. Identical. When I looked up, I saw movement in the toll booth. Through the window, a figure sat in my chair, processing tickets for cars that hadn't yet arrived. The silhouette matched mine, but its movements were slightly off rhythm, like a recording played at the wrong speed. It raised one hand to its face in a gesture I recognized, rubbing the bridge of the nose with thumb and forefinger, a habit I'd developed to ward off the headaches that came with staring at the ticket machine's bright screen in the surrounding darkness. I ran back to the booth. Empty. My chair still warm from my own body heat. The ticket machine humming its usual mechanical song. On the counter, 3 new drawings. My profile from different angles, each one showing me with my eyes closed, my expression peaceful, as though I were sleeping or dead or simply absent from myself. The pen sat next to the drawings, cap off, a small pool of ink collecting at its tip. I tried calling Dale. His voicemail picked up immediately, his recorded voice cheerful and distant. "You've reached Dale Preston, shift supervisor for Washington State Ferries Terminal 3. Leave a message and I'll get back to you during business hours. Dale, it's me at booth 3. Something's wrong with the..." I paused, trying to find words that wouldn't make me sound insane. "The tickets are printing wrong. And I think someone else is here. Someone who shouldn't be here. Call me back." I didn't mention the drawings or the reflections or the version of myself I'd seen driving onto a ferry that refused to leave the dock. At 5:12 a.m., the ferry's horn sounded, one long blast that shook the air and sent vibrations through the concrete beneath my feet. But the MV Wenatchee remained silent and still, its horn unpowered, its engines cold. The sound had come from somewhere else, somewhere that existed adjacent to this place, overlapping it like a photograph double exposed. The cars began to disembark. One by one, they rolled off the ferry that hadn't departed, headlights cutting through the gathering mist. I counted them as they passed. 44 vehicles, though the manifest showed only 42 had boarded. Each driver's face blurred as they went by, features smearing like wet paint, except for the ones who looked exactly like me. Those faces were perfectly clear, perfectly detailed, perfectly wrong. The last car to disembark parked in front of my booth instead of continuing to the exit. The window rolled down. The driver was me again, but older this time, with lines around the eyes and a weariness that went deeper than lack of sleep. He handed me a ticket, the one I'd printed for him in some future or past iteration of this night. "You're catching on," he said, and his voice was mine but roughened by time or damage. "What is this?" I managed to ask. "The shift," he said. "It doesn't end. It just loops. Over and over. You'll understand soon. You're almost at the moment where you start to remember." "Remember what?" He smiled, and it was the saddest expression I'd ever seen on any face, let alone my own. "That you already worked today's shift, and yesterday's, and every shift for the last 8 months. That you've been here much longer than you think. That the interview with Dale happened differently than you remember. It was a phone call, not face-to-face, because Dale won't come to the terminal anymore. Won't say why." My hands felt numb. "I don't understand." "You will, right around dawn. That's when it resets. That's when you forget again and start fresh, thinking it's just another night." He put the car in gear. "The rain helps sometimes. Focus on the rain. It's the only thing that's consistent, the only thing that proves something changed." "But it hasn't rained," I said. "Hasn't it?" He drove away, merging into the exit lane and disappearing toward the highway. I stood there, breathing in the scent of rain on concrete that had never gotten wet, feeling moisture in the air that the weather couldn't explain, watching puddles reflect a ferry in motion, while the real ferry sat locked to the dock with iron and rope and the stubborn insistence of the physical world. I walked back into the booth. On the counter, a new drawing. My profile, eyes open this time, staring at something outside the frame. Beneath it, written in my handwriting, "Don't forget, the shift never ends." The ticket machine whirred to life. Paper emerged from the slot, fresh and warm from the printer. I picked it up. The timestamp read 6:47 a.m., dawn, when the night shift should end and the relief crew should arrive. But the name on the ticket was mine. The vehicle description matched my car, and the license plate number was perfect. KPL4279. No variations, no transpositions. I looked at my watch. 5:43 a.m. The booth's phone rang. I answered it before I could think better of it. "Toll booth 3, I said, my voice steady despite everything. "Hey, it's Dale." His voice sounded cautious, careful. "Got your message. You doing okay out there?" "I'm not sure. How long have I been working here?" A pause. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear his breathing on the other end of the line. "You tell me," he finally said. 8 months. That's what I remember. 8 months since you hired me." "And before that? Do you remember before that?" I tried to think back to my interview, to the conversation we'd had in his office or over the phone or wherever it had actually happened. The memory felt slippery, refusing to solidify into anything concrete. I remembered applying for the job, remembered needing work after what? The details dissolved when I tried to focus on them. "I don't know," I admitted. "Listen to me carefully," Dale said, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to remember it this time. I need you to hold on to it past dawn. Can you do that?" "Yes." You called me 18 months ago asking about a job. Said you'd been working the night shift at Terminal 3 and wanted to transfer to days. I told you there were no openings. You called back a month later asking about the same job, as though we'd never spoken. You didn't remember our first conversation. I hired you anyway, because you seemed desperate and because... He stopped, and I heard him take a breath. Because I felt responsible. For what? For not warning the guy before you, for not being honest about what happens on that shift. I worked it for 17 years, and I thought I was strong enough to handle it. Turns out, the terminal handles you instead. The booth's walls felt closer than they had a moment before. The space seemed to be contracting around me, or I was expanding to fill it, or the boundary between me and my surroundings was becoming harder to define. What happens at dawn? I asked. You reset. You forget. The shift starts over, and you think it's your first night, or your 10th, or your 100th. You process the same tickets for the same cars with the same wrong license plates. You see yourself coming and going. You find the drawings you made during previous loops. And every night, around 5 or 6 a.m., you start to remember. But then the sun comes up, and it all washes away like rain on pavement, and you're new again. How do I stop it? The silence on the other end of the line felt like a verdict. Dale? How do I stop it? I don't know, he said quietly. I don't know if you can. I got out by transferring to days, but I don't think I really got out. I think I'm still there too in some version of the shift. I think we all are. Everyone who worked that booth. We're all still there. Processing tickets, drawing pictures, watching reflections that show us things the real world won't. The call disconnected. I stood in the booth as the sky began to lighten in the east, that particular gray that precedes true dawn. The mist had thickened into something that wasn't quite rain, but left everything damp and glistening. I could hear water dripping, though I couldn't identify the source. The sound seemed to come from inside the walls, or inside my own head, or from the space between those two possibilities. At 6:15 a.m., the relief crew should have arrived. The booth remained empty except for me. I gathered all the drawings I'd made, all the profiles, all the sketches of myself from angles I couldn't have drawn from, and spread them out on the counter. 23 images, each one slightly different, each one showing me in progressive states of awareness or confusion or resignation. In the last drawing, my eyes were closed again, but my hand was still moving, pen to paper, drawing even in sleep or death or whatever state existed beyond waking. The ticket machine printed one final slip. I picked it up, already knowing what it would say. Timestamp, 6:47 a.m. Vehicle type, sedan. License plate, KPL 4279. Driver name, the field was blank, as though the system couldn't decide who I was or had given up trying to classify me. On the back of the ticket, in blue ink that matched the pen in my pocket, was a drawing of the toll booth, and inside the booth, visible through the window, was a figure at the counter. The figure was drawing, and on the paper in front of the figure was another drawing of the booth, smaller but still visible, with another figure inside it, also drawing. The pattern continued, shrinking into infinite recursion, versions of myself drawing versions of myself, all the way down to a point too small to see but large enough to contain everything. I looked up. Through the booth's window I could see the ferry. The MV Wenatchee was pulling away from the dock, its engines thrumming, its wake spreading white across the dark water. I could see cars on its deck, drivers behind their windshields, all of them heading somewhere that wasn't here. When I looked at the dock itself, the ferry was still secured in place, exactly where it had been all night. The reflection at the end of the ramp showed me standing in the booth, looking out at myself, mirrors facing mirrors, creating corridors of diminishing figures that stretched back through time, or forward, through it or sideways through some dimension that had no name. The sun broke the horizon. Light spilled across the water, across the concrete, across the booth where I stood holding a pen I didn't remember taking out, and a piece of paper that was somehow already half covered in drawings I didn't remember making. My profile, repeated over and over, each iteration showing me with slightly different expressions: confusion, understanding, fear, acceptance, and finally something that might have been peace or might have been surrender. The rain smell intensified, became overwhelming, filled my lungs with the scent of water and concrete and the particular odor of ink on paper. I looked down at the floor. It was wet, though I couldn't remember it raining. I looked at my hands. They were wet too, blue ink staining my fingers, the pen leaking through my pocket. My watch showed 6:47 a.m. The ticket machine began to hum, warming up for the day's first print job. I didn't remember sitting down, but I was in my chair now, hand resting on the counter, waiting for the first car to arrive. Outside the booth's window, the parking lot was empty. The ferry sat quiet at the dock, exactly where ferries were supposed to sit when they weren't moving. The water was calm. The sky was clear. Everything was normal. I found a piece of scratch paper and picked up my pen. Without thinking about it, my hand began to move, drawing a profile. Clean lines, confident strokes, a face that looked familiar in ways I couldn't quite explain. The drawing took shape quickly, almost without my conscious participation, as though my hand knew what to create before my mind could catch up. When I finished, I looked at what I'd drawn and felt a distant sense of recognition, like remembering a dream from years ago or seeing my reflection in water disturbed by wind. The paper smelled like rain. A car was pulling into the toll lane, headlights cutting through the morning mist. I set the drawing aside and prepared to greet them, to process their ticket, to send them onto the ferry that would take them across the Sound to whatever waited on the other side. Behind me, the booth phone rang. I let it ring while I helped the driver, printed their ticket, wished them a safe crossing. The phone kept ringing. 7 times. 8, 9. When I finally picked it up, there was only static and the distant sound of waves against concrete and something that might have been my own voice saying words I couldn't quite make out, as though I were calling from very far away or very close, or from somewhere that was both at once. "Toll booth 3, I said into the silence. The line went dead. I hung up and turned back to the counter where I'd left my drawing. Next to it, there were 2 more sketches. My profile from different angles, rendered in the same blue ink, with the same confident lines, showing me with my eyes closed as though I were sleeping. I didn't remember drawing them, but the pen in my pocket felt warm, recently used, and my fingers bore the slight indent that came from holding it too long in the same position. Outside, the ferry horn sounded, one long blast announcing departure. I watched through the booth window as the MV Wenatchee pulled away from the dock, its engines churning the water white, carrying its load of vehicles and passengers toward the opposite shore. The wake spread in clean lines across the Sound, catching the morning light. I looked back at the dock. The ferry was still there, secured by ropes, engines silent. Both things were true at the same time, and somewhere in that impossible simultaneity, I understood that the shift was just beginning, or perhaps it had never ended. The ticket machine hummed, ready to print whatever came next. Story 11. The wind knows things out here that the rest of the world has forgotten. I took the caretaker job because I needed distance. 3 months at the Bridger Ranch, 40 miles from the nearest town, seemed like the kind of silence that might let me think straight again. The owner lived in Denver now, hadn't been back in years. He just needed someone to check the fences, feed the horses, make sure the place didn't fall apart over winter. Simple work. Solitary work. The first thing I noticed was how the gates moved. Not swinging open, the way you'd expect with the Wyoming wind screaming across the high plains. They closed. Every single one of them, from the main entrance to the paddock gates to the small pen behind the barn. I'd watch them standing wide, braced against their posts, and then the wind would gust and they'd swing shut with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty land. Not violently, deliberately, like someone pulling them closed from the other side. I told myself it was the hinges, the angle of the slope, something about air pressure. But hinges don't explain the timing. They'd close in sequence, starting from the road and moving inward toward the main house, like footsteps. Gate after gate, working their way toward me. The second night, I heard the bells. Cattle bells hung from the rafters of the covered walkway between the house and barn. Old brass things gone green with age. The previous caretaker's note mentioned them but didn't explain why they were there or what they were for. There were no cattle on the property, just the 4 horses in the stable, and a barn cat that disappeared whenever I looked for it. The bells started ringing around midnight, not the random clatter of wind. This was deliberate, rhythmic. They rang in sequence, one after another, and I realized with cold certainty that they were counting down. 9 bells total. 9, 8, 7, 6. Clear as a clock ticking. I stood in the kitchen with my hand frozen on the coffee pot, listening to that impossible countdown, watching the shadows from the porch light swing across the floor with each ring. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. Sat in the chair by the window with all the lights on, watching the darkness beyond the glass, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The wind continued its conversation with the empty land. The gate stayed closed. The bells hung motionless. Morning came late and gray, the sun hidden behind low clouds that seemed to press down on the ranch like a hand. I did my rounds mechanically, checking water troughs, measuring grain, mucking stalls. The horses watched me work with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Not hungry interest. Recognition, like they were waiting for me to remember something. I found the compass on the 3rd day. It was sitting on the porch railing, brass and old, the kind sailors used to carry. I picked it up, thinking one of the owners must have left it, but the needle didn't point north. It pointed toward the barn. I turned the compass in my hand, walked around the porch, went out into the yard. Didn't matter. The needle swung and steadied, always pointing at the barn's double doors. My hand started shaking. I set the compass down on the rail and backed away, but that was worse somehow. Leaving it there felt like refusing to acknowledge something that had already been acknowledged. I picked it up again and shoved it in my pocket, where it sat like a hot coal against my thigh. The barn had always felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just patient, like it was waiting for the right moment. The structure was older than the house, weathered wood and iron fixtures that had survived a century of high plains winters. It smelled of hay and leather, and something else, something older than rot. The 4 horses occupied the eastern stalls. The western side held equipment, saddles, coils of rope, tools whose purposes I couldn't guess. I'd avoided looking too closely at that western side, told myself I was being efficient, focusing on necessary tasks. But I knew the real reason. Part of me didn't want to see what was there. The compass pulled me toward it that afternoon. Not physically. I could have walked away. But the weight in my pocket felt heavier with each step I took toward the house. Lighter when I turned toward the barn. By the time I crossed the threshold into that dusty darkness, my legs were moving on autopilot. The saddle sat on the 3rd rack, exactly where it had always been. I'd seen it before, of course. Glanced at it while counting equipment, dismissed it as just another piece of old tack. But now I moved closer, close enough to see the leather grain, the careful stitching, the silver conchos dull with age. My shadow fell across it, and in that moment I saw the mark. My name, burned into the leather backing. Not a name like mine. My actual name, first and last, in the exact handwriting I'd used to sign the caretaker contract. The barn tilted around me. I reached out to steady myself against the rack, and my hand landed on the saddle's smooth surface. It was warm. Body warm. Like someone had just been sitting in it. I ran. Just turned and stumbled out into the daylight, my breath coming in sharp gasps that burned my throat. The horses watched me from their stalls, and their eyes held something I couldn't name. Not malice. Expectation. That night, the bells rang again. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I stood at my bedroom window watching the barn. The compass sat on my nightstand, needle pointing steadily through 2 walls and across 40 yards of frozen ground. Pointing at that saddle, at my name. The counting continued every night. I started marking time by it. The way sailors mark watches, everything became before the bells or after the bells. I stopped eating much. Food tasted like dust and sat heavy in my stomach. Sleep came in fragments, never more than an hour at a stretch. I'd wake gasping, certain that something had been leaning over me in the darkness, breathing my own breath back into my face. The horses knew. I'd be working in the stables, and they'd all turn their heads at the same moment, looking at nothing, staring at empty air with such focus that I'd turn too, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was only dust motes drifting through bars of light, only the creak of wood settling, only my own reflection in the tack room mirror looking more haggard each day. Then they started the stomping, all 4 of them, in perfect unison, 3 strikes of their front hooves, always 3, and always when I was thinking about leaving, about getting in my truck and driving away from this place, about breaking the contract and the isolation and the weight that had settled into my bones. They knew where I'd been thinking of going, except I hadn't gone there yet. That's what kept me frozen, that impossible knowledge in their dark eyes, the certainty that they were aware of something I hadn't done, somewhere I hadn't gone. Future tense made past. Time folded back on itself like paper, and I was caught in the crease. I started talking to myself just to hear a human voice. Sometimes I'd narrate my actions, a running commentary of mundane tasks. Other times I'd argue with myself, debate whether to stay or go, list reasons and counter reasons until the words lost meaning. The sound of my own voice became strange, like listening to a recording where the pitch is slightly off. Was I always this hoarse? Did I always hesitate on certain syllables? The compass never wavered. I carried it everywhere now, checking it compulsively. Kitchen to bedroom, bedroom to barn, barn to kitchen. The needle swung and settled, always pointing toward that western wall, that 3rd rack, that saddle with my name burned into leather that shouldn't exist. I tried researching the ranch's history. The internet connection was satellite, slow and unreliable, but I managed to pull up property records, old newspaper archives, fragments of information. The Bridger family had owned this land for 3 generations. The barn predated their ownership by at least 50 years. Before that, nothing. Just blank space in the records where information should have been. There was a survey map from 1887 that showed structures on the property, but the barn wasn't among them. Yet the brand on the main beam read 1873, 14 years before it officially existed. I thought about calling the owner in Denver, rehearsed the conversation in my head 100 times. How do you explain that a compass only points at one building? That cattle bells count down to nothing? That horses stomp 3 times when you think about leaving? How do you say your name is on a saddle that's been here longer than you've been alive without sounding completely unhinged? I didn't make the call. Instead, I started spending more time in the barn. Not avoiding it anymore, but drawn to it. The way you press on a bruise to make sure it still hurts. I'd sit on a hay bale and stare at the saddle, trying to find some rational explanation. Someone's idea of a prank, a coincidence of names, a hallucination brought on by isolation and bad sleep and too much silence. But the leather was real. The letters were real. The heat that seemed to emanate from the saddle in the coldest part of the day was real. On the 11th night, the countdown changed. The bells rang as always, but after the final chime, there was a long pause. Then they rang once more, a single clear note that hung in the frozen air. 1. Not 9 to 1. Just 1. Singular. Waiting. The horses began to move. I heard them from my bedroom, the shuffle of hooves in straw, the creak of stall doors that shouldn't have been able to open. I went to the window and saw them filing out of the barn in single file, moving across the yard to stand in the open space between the house and the main gate. 4 horses arranged in a perfect line, all facing the same direction. They were looking at the road, at the place where headlights would first appear if someone were driving in, at the point where arrival begins. But there was no one coming. The road stretched empty into darkness, marked only by fence posts and the occasional reflection of starlight on ice. I watched them for an hour. They never moved, never shifted weight or flicked an ear or showed any sign of the restlessness that should have driven them back to shelter. They just stood and watched and waited. When I finally went downstairs, intending to herd them back to the barn, they turned as one to look at me. The moonlight caught their eyes and turned them silver. For a moment, I saw myself reflected there, but wrong. Standing in the barn doorway instead of on the porch, wearing different clothes, holding something I couldn't quite make out. Then one of them stomped. 3 times. And I knew. They weren't waiting for someone to arrive. They were waiting for me to arrive. To become the version of myself they could already see. The one who belonged to that saddle, whose name had been there all along, who had always been here even before I drove through the gate 3 weeks ago. Time wasn't moving forward. It was looping back, catching its tail, and I was the point where past and future met. The compass burned in my pocket. I pulled it out, and for the first time since I'd found it, the needle wavered, swung between the barn and the horses. The barn and the horses, unable to decide, or deciding something I couldn't understand. The brass case grew hot in my palm, almost too hot to hold, and I realized it wasn't pointing at the saddle anymore. It was pointing at me. I am the destination. I have always been the destination. The gates opened in sequence, starting from the innermost point and working outward, each one swinging wide with the same deliberate motion, the same metallic clang. 9 gates. The cattle bells began to ring. Not counting down this time. Counting up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The horses turned as one and walked back into the barn. I followed them. What else could I do? The compass needle pointed at my chest now, quivering like an arrow shot into a target. My feet moved without conscious thought, carrying me across the frozen ground, through the double doors, into the dusty darkness where leather and hay and old metal waited. The saddle was exactly as I'd left it. My name stared back at me from the worn surface. But now I could see other marks too, scratched into the leather around the letters. Dates. Dozens of them, carved in tiny script. They stretched back decades, centuries maybe. Different handwriting, different tools, but all the same date, repeated over and over. Tomorrow's date. I reached out and touched the leather, and memory flooded through me like ice water. Not my memories. Or maybe they were mine, just from a time I haven't lived yet. Standing in this exact spot, feeling the weight of the saddle on my hands, knowing I have to put it on, knowing what happens when I do. The horses watched from their stalls. The bells hung silent overhead. The compass needle spun in slow circles, unable to find north, unable to find anything except the void I'd been walking toward since I signed that contract, since I drove through that gate, since I saw the job posting and felt that strange pull toward Wyoming and wide spaces and wind that knows things. I lift the saddle from its rack. It fits my hands perfectly, worn to the exact shape of my grip. I carry it toward the tack room, where there's a mirror, where I can see myself holding this impossible thing. My reflection watches me approach, but it's ahead of me somehow, always a step closer to the mirror than I am. When I reach the glass, my reflection sets the saddle down first. I set it down second. The wind picks up outside, and I hear the gates closing in sequence, starting from the road and working inward. The countdown has begun again. 9, 8, 7, 6. I have time. Not much, but some. Enough to make a choice. Except the horses are stomping. 3 times, all 4 of them. 3, 3, 3. They know where I've been. They know where I'm going. They know that past and future are the same thing when you're standing at the center of a loop that never ends. The bells reach 1. I look at my reflection. It looks back at me. Neither of us moves. The compass lies on the ground between us, needle spinning faster now, becoming a blur of silver that catches the last light of day, or the first light of tomorrow. I can't tell anymore which direction time is moving. Outside, I hear an engine, tires on gravel, someone pulling up to the gate, getting out, walking toward the house, footsteps that match the rhythm of closing gates, the countdown of bells, the stomping of knowing horses. I recognize the sound of those footsteps. They're mine. The person walking toward this barn is me. The me who signed the contract, who drove through the gate, who found the compass and saw my name on the saddle. The me who is still arriving, who has always been arriving, who will arrive again tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Because this is the waiting place, and what we're waiting for is ourselves. My reflection steps back from the mirror. I step forward. We pass through the glass without breaking it, and for one moment I feel the cold burn of transition, of becoming and unbecoming at once. Then I'm standing in the barn, exactly where I've always been standing, watching someone who looks like me walk toward the house for the first time. The gates close behind him in sequence. The bells begin their countdown. The horses turn to watch. I lift the saddle and carry it to the third rack. Tomorrow, I'll find it there. Tomorrow, I'll see my name and feel this same cold knowledge settling into my bones. Tomorrow, I'll understand too late that I never left, never could leave, never wanted anything except this moment of recognition when past and future collapse into the eternal now of wind and brass and leather, worn smooth by hands that have always been mine. The compass needle finally stops spinning. It points at the gate, at the place where arrival begins and never ends. I wait for tomorrow, for myself, for the moment when I'll drive through that gate for the first time again, and again, and again. The wind knows things out here that the rest of the world has forgotten. I'm starting to remember them too. Story 12. The vending machine ate my dollar again. I stood in the fluorescent glare of the Arizona rest stop break room, listening to the mechanical whir as the bill disappeared into the slot. 3 seconds later, the change dispenser coughed up 4 quarters. I caught them in my palm, already knowing what I'd find. My initials, scratched into the surface of each coin with something sharp. JM. The same marks I'd seen on yesterday's change, and the day before that, going back 2 weeks now. I held 1 quarter up to the flickering light. The scratches weren't random. They were deliberate, precise. The kind of marks you'd make if you were sitting somewhere with time to kill and a knife in your pocket. The kind of marks I used to make on everything I owned back in high school, before I learned that marking territory only matters if you plan to stay. The break room clock read 2:47 a.m., 5 hours left on my shift. 5 hours until dawn broke over the interstate, and the first travelers pulled in for coffee and bathroom breaks, bringing with them the comfortable anonymity of constant motion. Out here on the night shift, the I-17 rest stop became something else entirely, a pocket of stillness where the highway's endless flow seemed to eddy and pool. I dropped the quarters into my jacket pocket where they clinked against the others. 73 cents now, all marked. I'd stopped using them in the vending machines after the first week. Something about feeding my own initials back into the machine felt wrong, like completing a circuit I didn't understand. The break room door stuck as always, swollen from decades of desert heat. I shouldered it open and stepped back into the main corridor, where the overhead lights cast everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that makes healthy skin look jaundiced. My footsteps echoed on the tile floor, the sound swallowed quickly by the white noise of ventilation systems and the distant hum of the highway beyond the walls. The bulletin board caught my eye as I passed. I'd walked by it twice already tonight, but something made me stop this time. The usual clutter of notices covered its surface. A faded flyer for a church potluck from 3 months ago, a reminder about proper sanitation procedures, a schedule for maintenance that never seemed to match when anyone actually showed up to work. But pinned in the center, partially hidden beneath a notice about changes to the interstate exit numbering system, was a road map. Not the official Arizona Department of Transportation maps we kept in the information rack. This was older, the paper yellowed and soft at the creases. Someone had drawn on it with a yellow highlighter, tracing a route that wound north from Phoenix, following the I-17 through Black Canyon City, past Sunset Point, all the way up to this exit. Mile marker 252. The line ended in a bright fluorescent circle right where I was standing. I pulled the map free from its pushpin. The paper felt waxy, slightly damp. The highlighted route didn't continue beyond this point. No return path, no indication of where the journey was meant to go after arriving here. Just that terminal circle, like a target or a drain. In the bottom corner, someone had written in pencil, "Started, April 7th. Back soon." I checked the date on my phone. April 7th was 3 weeks ago. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, though the air in the corridor was perfectly still. I pinned the map back to the board, making sure to cover it again with the exit number notice. Better if I didn't see it every time I walked past. My rounds took me through the building's perimeter, checking that all the exterior doors were locked, making sure no one had decided to bed down in the family restroom, confirming that the vending machines were all operational and that no one had vandalized the tourist information displays. The work was mind-numbing by design, repetitive enough to make the hours pass without requiring actual thought. But tonight, my mind wouldn't settle into its usual static hum. I found myself pausing at the men's restroom, my hand on the door. I wasn't planning to go in. I'd cleaned it an hour ago and wouldn't need to check it again until after 4, but I stood there anyway, feeling the cool metal of the door handle against my palm. My reflection fragmented in the small window of reinforced glass. The thought came unbidden. Maybe I should just leave. Inside the restroom, I heard the sound of water running. I pushed through the door. The motion sensor lights flickered on, revealing 3 sinks, 2 stalls, and the faint smell of industrial cleaning solution. The middle sink was running, a steady stream of water splashing into the white porcelain basin. I walked over and twisted the handle, feeling the resistance of the automatic shut-off mechanism I'd triggered. 12 seconds. That's how long the water ran before cutting off. I stood at the sink, watching my reflection in the mirror. The fluorescent lights made the shadows under my eyes look like bruises. When had I last slept properly? The night shift had scrambled my circadian rhythm into something unrecognizable. Not day, not night, but some third category of time that existed only in this building. The water cut off. Silence rushed in to fill the space. Then, without my touching anything, the faucet on the left turned on. I stared at it. 12 seconds of water, splashing with mechanical indifference. I reached for the handle, then stopped. If I turned it off, would another turn on? Would they all start running in sequence one after another, responding to an input I couldn't see? Maybe I should just leave. The thought had come again, and with it, the water stopped. Exactly 12 seconds. I backed out of the restroom, letting the door swing shut behind me. In the corridor, the ventilation seemed louder than before, a rhythmic whoosh that reminded me of breathing. My shift supervisor, Derek, had mentioned something during my training about the building's HVAC system being overly sensitive. It cycled on and off based on motion sensors and temperature fluctuations, creating patterns that could feel almost responsive if you paid too much attention. That's all this was. Patterns. The human brain was designed to find them, even in randomness. The staff corridor led past the storage room and the utility closet, both locked, keys hanging from my belt with a dozen others I never used. At the far end, the emergency exit glowed with its red sign, the kind that never goes dark. I walked toward it, my footsteps falling into rhythm with the ventilation cycles. My phone buzzed in my pocket. No signal out here, never had been. The text had been waiting to deliver for the past hour, finally finding enough stray cellular signal to push through. It was from Derek. Inventory sheets in your locker. Need them filled by end of shift. I typed back an acknowledgement, knowing it wouldn't send until morning. The rest stop existed in a communication dead zone, cut off from the network of cellular towers that made the rest of the world feel connected. Management had promised to install a signal booster 3 times in the past year. It never happened. My locker was in the staff area, past the break room. I'd been avoiding going back there since finding the quarters, but Derek's request gave me a reason to face the space again. The locker room was even smaller than the break room, just a row of narrow metal lockers and a bench bolted to the floor. Mine was third from the left, combination lock hanging open because I'd stopped bothering to secure it after realizing no one else ever came in here during night shifts. The inventory sheets weren't in my locker. What was in my locker was a folded piece of paper I'd never seen before, resting on top of my spare jacket. I picked it up slowly, already knowing it would feel wrong in my hands. The paper was the same texture as the map on the bulletin board, that same waxy, slightly damp quality. I unfolded it. 5 words in handwriting I recognized immediately as my own. "You forgot the return trip." My fingers went numb. The paper drifted to the floor. I hadn't written that. I would remember writing something like that. But the handwriting was unmistakable. The way I formed my Ys with a tail that curled left. The specific angle of my Rs. I'd filled out hundreds of forms since taking this job, left notes for the day shift, scribbled observations in the maintenance log. This was exactly how my writing looked. I bent to pick up the note, my knees cracking in the silence. The paper felt warm now, as if it had been held in someone's hand for a long time, as if I'd been holding it. The break room door slammed shut in the next room. I was through my locker room door in seconds. The note crumpled in my fist. The break room was empty, the door closed but still trembling slightly in its frame. No windows, no other exits. Just the vending machines humming their mechanical song, and the clock on the wall that now read 3:23 a.m. Had I really been in the locker room for 36 minutes? I smoothed out the note on the break room table, trying to think rationally about this. Someone was messing with me. Had to be. Derek, maybe, or one of the maintenance crew who sometimes showed up at odd hours. This was an elaborate prank. Coins and maps and planted notes, designed to make the night shift guy lose his mind in the empty hours before dawn. Except the handwriting was mine. The coins had my initials. The map had appeared on a bulletin board I checked multiple times every shift. My phone showed 3:23 a.m. but felt wrong in my hand. Too light or too heavy. The screen brightness all wrong despite not having changed the settings. I opened my photos, scrolling back through the random images I'd accumulated in the past weeks. Parking lot views, a sunset over the desert, a spider I'd found in the storage room that Derek made me capture and release. I stopped on a photo from 2 days ago. The bulletin board. I'd taken a picture of it to send Derek when he'd asked if we'd received the new scheduling notices. In the photo, the road map was clearly visible, the yellow highlighter route standing out against the faded paper. But I'd only noticed the map tonight. I was certain of it. Unless I wasn't. I left the break room, walking faster now. The corridor stretched longer than it should, the far end seeming to recede as I approached. Optical illusion, I told myself. Fatigue playing tricks with perspective and fluorescent lights. I'd worked too many nights in a row, let myself get too isolated out here in the desert silence. The bulletin board waited where I'd left it. I yanked the map free again, holding it up to examine in the harsh light. The yellow line was there, ending at mile marker 252. But now I could see something else. Places where the highlighter had been drawn over multiple times, making the line darker, as if someone had traced and retraced the route obsessively. The paper beneath had started to deteriorate from the repeated strokes, tiny holes forming where the marker had pressed too hard. At the bottom, below the date, someone had added another note in that same pencil script. "Don't forget again." My hands were shaking. I crumpled the map and shoved it into my jacket pocket, alongside the quarters and the note from my locker. Evidence. I was collecting evidence, though I couldn't say of what or for whom. The desert pressed against the rest stop's walls, vast and indifferent. Through the main entrance windows, I could see the parking lot lights creating islands of illumination in the darkness. A single car was parked in the far corner, a dark sedan that had been there since my shift started but showed no signs of occupancy. I'd assumed it belonged to a traveler who'd decided to sleep before continuing their journey, but now I wondered if I should check. Protocol said to knock on windows if a vehicle remained stationary for more than 3 hours. I didn't want to go outside. The realization stopped me in the middle of the corridor. I didn't want to go outside into that parking lot. Didn't want to cross that threshold into the desert night. The building felt safer somehow, for all its flickering lights and responsive faucets. Out there was too open, too much empty space where anything could approach unseen. When had I started thinking that way? A rattling sound drew my attention to the vending machines. I walked over slowly, watching as the snack machine began cycling through its display lights in sequence. Yellow, green, red, blue, yellow, green, red, blue. Like a slot machine waiting for someone to pull the lever. The pattern repeated 7 times before stopping on blue, a bag of chips highlighted behind the glass. I hadn't put money in. The machine hadn't been touched. Blue was my favorite color. Had been since I was a kid. I'd never told anyone here that. Never put it on any forms, or mentioned it in conversation. It was just one of those arbitrary preferences that define a person in small, meaningless ways. The chips cost $1.25. I reached into my pocket, feeling the quarters marked with my initials. 73 cents worth. I'd need to feed the machine a dollar bill for the rest, which meant getting change back. Change that would probably be marked. I didn't buy the chips. Instead, I walked to the main entrance and stared out at the parking lot. The dark sedan hadn't moved. Beyond it, the I-17 was nearly empty. Just the occasional pair of headlights streaking past headed north or south. Brief interruptions in the desert's permanence. The highway existed independent of this place, I reminded myself. All those cars were going somewhere, carrying people with destinations and purposes and return trips planned. You forgot the return trip. I pulled out my phone and tried to call Derek, knowing it wouldn't work, but needing to try anyway. No signal. The screen's glow felt accusatory in the darkness, illuminating my face in the glass reflection. I looked wrong somehow. Not different exactly, but wrong in the way a word starts to feel wrong when you repeat it too many times. My features were all where they should be, arranged in the configuration I'd lived with for 32 years, but they didn't feel like mine. Behind my reflection in the glass, I caught movement in the corridor. I spun around, my heart suddenly loud in my ears. Nothing. Empty corridor, fluorescent lights, closed restroom doors. But I'd seen something. A figure, a shadow, the impression of motion where nothing was moving. The men's restroom door was slightly ajar. I'd closed it. I always closed it. I approached slowly, every horror movie I'd ever seen suddenly playing through my mind. This was the moment where the protagonist makes the stupid decision, walks toward danger instead of away, investigates the strange noise, opens the door that should stay closed. This was where everything goes wrong. But this was also my job. My rounds required checking the restrooms regularly. If something was wrong, if someone had come in through an entrance I'd somehow missed, I needed to know. I pushed the door open. Motion sensors activated. Lights flickered on. The middle sink turned on automatically, water splashing into the basin. 12 seconds. I counted them, standing in the doorway. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The water stopped. I stepped fully into the restroom, letting the door swing closed behind me. 3 sinks, 2 stalls, tile floor gleaming with recent cleaning. Everything exactly as it should be. I checked the stalls. Empty toilet paper dispensers full, nothing out of place. But the mirror had something new. Condensation. As if someone had just taken a hot shower, though the restroom had no shower facilities. The fog covered the entire surface, obscuring my reflection. And in the condensation, someone had drawn with their finger. A simple circle, a target, a drain, mile marker 252. My breath caught. I reached up to touch the mirror, feeling the cool dampness against my fingertips. The circle was fresh, still wet. The edges hadn't started to evaporate yet. I was alone in the restroom. I had been alone the entire time, hadn't I? The left sink turned on. 12 seconds of water, then the right, then the middle again, a sequence, a pattern, a message in the rhythm of automated plumbing. I stood frozen, watching water splash and splash and splash, counting unconsciously. 12, 12, 12. I thought about leaving, not just the restroom, the whole building, getting in my car and driving away from this job, this place, this stretch of I-17 that seemed to have its hooks in me deeper than employment should reach. I could be back in Phoenix by dawn, could find another job, could pretend these 3 months had never happened. All 3 sinks turned on simultaneously. The sound was deafening in the small space, water hammering against porcelain and stereo. But I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had drained out of me somewhere in the counting, leaving behind something colder and more certain. I knew these sinks. I cleaned them every night. I'd replaced the washers on the middle one just last week when it wouldn't stop dripping. I'd memorized the graffiti scratched into the stall walls, knew which tiles were cracked, and which lights hummed with a frequency that gave me headaches. This was my territory. I'd marked it with my presence for 3 months of night shifts. Had walked these corridors so many times my footsteps had probably worn grooves in the tile that would outlast my employment. The sinks turned off in sequence. Left, right, middle, 12 seconds apart. I wiped the condensation from the mirror, clearing the circle away with my palm. My reflection emerged from the fog, drawn back into existence by the removal of moisture. I looked the same as always, tired, slightly stubbled, the kind of anonymous face that fits perfectly in service industry positions where being forgettable is an asset. But my eyes were different, more focused maybe, more aware of something I couldn't quite name. I left the restroom and walked back to the main corridor. The bulletin board waited. I unpinned everything: the potluck flyer, the sanitation reminder, the maintenance schedule, the exit number changes. All of it went into the trash can beside the water fountain. The road map I left pinned in the center, the yellow highlighted route clearly visible. Someone needed to see it. Maybe not me. Maybe the day shift attendant or Derek or one of the travelers who passed through looking for directions. Someone would look at that map and recognize the route, would understand the significance of the circle at mile marker 252. My locker was still open when I returned to the staff area. I pulled out my spare jacket and put it on, zipping it up against a cold I couldn't feel. The inventory sheets Derek had mentioned weren't anywhere in the small metal space. They'd never been here. He'd sent that text to give me a reason to check my locker, to find the note that I'd somehow written and folded and placed there myself. "You forgot the return trip." I sat on the bench, quarters digging into my thigh through my pocket, 73 cents in marked coins. How many times had I used those machines? How many times had I received change that I'd then marked with my own initials, creating a loop I couldn't remember entering? The staff corridor lights were dimmer than usual, or maybe my eyes were adjusting to a darkness that had been present all along. I could hear the ventilation system breathing, could feel the building settling around me like a living thing finding comfort. Somewhere in the distance, out on the I-17, a semi-truck's air horn echoed through the desert night. Morning was still 3 hours away. I stood up and continued my rounds, walking the perimeter I'd walked countless times before. Past the vending machines where the chip bag still glowed blue in its slot. Past the bulletin board where my highlighted route ended in its fluorescent circle. Past the restroom where the sinks waited to respond to thoughts I didn't know I was broadcasting. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was perfectly in order. I checked my phone. 4:47 a.m. Derek would arrive at 7 to relieve me, would ask about the inventory sheets I couldn't find, would wonder why I'd cleared the bulletin board. Or maybe he wouldn't wonder at all. The dark sedan was still in the parking lot when I glanced out the main entrance. Still no movement, no signs of life. Just a car that had been there since my shift started, possibly longer. I'd never checked the parking lot before my shift began, never thought to see what vehicles were already present when I arrived. What if it was mine? What if I'd driven here and forgotten, left my car in the far corner like a traveler planning to rest before continuing a journey? But my car was in the employee lot. I'd parked it there at 10 p.m., had locked it, and walked across to the rest stop entrance the way I always did. My keys were in my pocket right now, next to the marked quarters and the crumpled note. Weren't they? I pulled out my keys. They looked right. Car key, apartment key, the various locker and door keys for the rest stop. All present, All correct, but they felt too heavy in my palm, weighted with significance they shouldn't carry. The clock above the main entrance read 5:12 a.m. I'd lost time again. 25 minutes had passed while I'd been standing here, staring at a sedan in the parking lot and questioning my own keys. This was how it happened, I realized. This was how people lost themselves. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but in these small gaps. These moments of discontinuity that accumulated until the person you'd been was no longer the person you were. I'd taken this job 3 months ago because I needed work and the night shift paid better. A temporary solution while I figured out what came next. But I couldn't remember what had come before. Couldn't remember the interview with Derek or the training period or making the decision to accept the position. I remembered doing the work. 3 months of rounds and cleaning and checking locks and restocking toilet paper. But the beginning was fuzzy, like trying to recall a dream after waking. The break room door was open again. I could see the vending machines from here, their displays cycling through colors in no pattern I could identify. Yellow, green, red, blue, yellow, yellow, green, red, blue, blue. A code maybe, a message hidden in the sequence. Or just machines malfunctioning in a rest stop on a lonely stretch of interstate where the night shift attendant was slowly losing his grip on what was real. I walked back to my locker and sat down on the bench. From this angle, I could see into the break room, could watch the vending machines perform their light show, while the clock on the wall counted down to dawn. The note was still crumpled in my pocket. I smoothed it out on my knee, reading my own handwriting for the 100th time. You forgot the return trip. But to return, you first had to leave. You had to start somewhere else, to mark a beginning point that was separate from the destination. The map on the bulletin board showed a route that ended here, at mile marker 252. But where had it started? Phoenix was marked on the map, but the highlighted line didn't begin there. It simply appeared on the road already in progress, as if the journey had no true origin. The ventilation system cycled off, and in the sudden silence, I heard something else. Footsteps. In the main corridor, moving away from my location. I stood up slowly, every sense suddenly alert. Derek wasn't due for another 2 hours. No cars had pulled into the parking lot. The building had been empty except for me. Unless it hadn't been. I walked to the locker room door and peered out into the staff corridor. Empty. But the sound of footsteps continued, growing fainter, heading toward the main entrance. I followed. The corridor seemed longer than before, the distance to the main area stretching elastic and strange. My own footsteps echoed wrong, arriving at my ears a fraction of a second delayed, as if the sound had to travel through something thicker than air. The footsteps ahead stopped. I reached the main corridor and looked both ways. Nothing. No one. Just the empty rest stop in its pre-dawn stillness, lit by flickering fluorescence and the red glow of emergency exits. But the main entrance door was slightly ajar. Cold desert air leaked through the gap, carrying with it the smell of creosote and dust. I'd locked that door. I locked it every night at midnight. Part of my rounds. I approached it slowly, aware that stepping outside would break some kind of protection I'd built around myself through routine and familiarity. Out there was the parking lot with its lone sedan. Out there was the I-17, with its endless flow toward destinations I couldn't name. Out there was the desert, vast and indifferent and waiting. The door swung open wider, moved by a breeze I couldn't feel. I stepped through. The parking lot was exactly as I'd seen it through the window, pools of light surrounded by darkness, the sedan in its far corner, the I-17 visible beyond the perimeter fence. But the air was wrong. Too still, too warm for pre-dawn in the Arizona desert. The kind of air that settles in places where time moves differently. My car was in the employee lot. I turned to look, needing to confirm its presence. The employee lot was empty. I walked toward where I'd parked, my footsteps loud on the asphalt. The space where my car should have been showed no oil stains, no indication anything had ever been parked there. Just clean pavement marked with fading yellow lines. A sound behind me made me turn. The dark sedan's brake lights flared red, just for a second. Then darkness again. I walked toward it, crossing the parking lot in a diagonal that took me past the main entrance where I'd just emerged. Through the windows, I could see the rest stop interior, the bulletin board with its map, the vending machines, the corridor leading to the restrooms. And I could see myself, standing in the staff corridor, looking out toward the parking lot. I stopped walking. The figure inside didn't. It continued its rounds, passing the bulletin board, heading toward the break room, following a routine it had followed 100 times before. The sedan's engine started. I didn't hear it exactly. The sound was muffled, distant, as if coming from somewhere else entirely, but I felt it, a vibration in the air that resonated with something in my chest. I turned away from the rest stop, away from the figure still walking its rounds inside, and approached the sedan. Up close, I could see the dust coating its surface, the way the paint had faded from long exposure to desert sun. This was a car that had been parked here for much longer than one night. The driver's side door was unlocked. I opened it and looked inside. The interior was clean, almost sterile. No personal effects, no trash, no indication anyone had ever driven this vehicle anywhere. Just black upholstery and a dashboard that glowed softly in the pre-dawn darkness. And on the driver's seat, a road map. Yellow highlighter marking a route from this rest stop south toward Phoenix, a reverse of the path that had brought someone here. The return trip I'd forgotten. I picked up the map, feeling its waxy texture, its slight dampness. In the bottom corner in pencil, a date. Started July 15th. Today's date. I looked back at the rest stop. Through the windows, the figure that was me continued its rounds, unaware of the parking lot, the sedan, the map, the return route. It would walk those corridors until 7 a.m. when Derek arrived for the day shift. It would hand off the keys and the maintenance log and drive back to an apartment it couldn't quite remember. Would sleep through the hot afternoon hours and return at 10 p.m. to do it all again. It would keep doing that until it finally looked at the map on the bulletin board, really looked, and understood what the yellow circle meant. The sedan's passenger door opened by itself, an invitation I didn't remember extending. I got in, still holding the map. The door closed with a solid thunk that felt final. The engine hummed beneath me, vibrating through the seat, through my bones. A frequency that matched something I'd been hearing in the ventilation system for 3 months. Through the windshield, I could see the I-17 stretching south toward Phoenix. Dawn was starting to gray the eastern horizon, burning away the stars. In an hour, the day shift would arrive. Travelers would pull in for coffee and bathroom breaks. The rest stop would fill with motion and noise and life. The figure inside would continue its rounds, marking coins, studying maps, listening to faucets respond to thoughts it didn't know it was broadcasting. I looked down at the map in my hands, at the return route someone had carefully highlighted. The paper trembled slightly, though my hands were steady. The sedan began to roll forward, toward the exit, toward the highway, toward a destination that might be Phoenix or might be somewhere else entirely. I didn't touch the steering wheel. I didn't need to. In my pocket, the quarters clinked softly as we turned onto the access road. 73 cents worth of coins marked with initials that might be mine, or might belong to someone else who'd forgotten their own return trip, and stayed too long in the fluorescent silence of mile marker 252. The rest stop receded in the rearview mirror, growing smaller until it was just another set of buildings beside the highway, indistinguishable from 1,000 others scattered across the interstate system. I never looked back to see if the figure in the corridor had noticed my absence. I never looked back to see if it was still there at all.